The universe may not be broken. It may simply be unattended. Not paused, not collapsed, not dying, just still running. Imagine opening an old server room beneath a building no one has entered for decades. The lights are dim. The fans still spin. Processes continue to consume power. Logs keep writing themselves line by line. No administrator, no updates, no one watching the dashboard. Yet everything keeps going. Now pause for a moment and let a quieter thought settle in. What if this is exactly where we are? Not at the center of a grand plan, not at the climax of a cosmic story, but inside a universe that was set in motion long ago and then quietly left alone. No shutdown command, no final instruction, just continuity. Stars still burn because nothing told them to stop. Particles still collide because the equations never expired. Time still flows because the clock was never unplugged. And here we are, conscious, wondering, listening inside a system that no longer checks if we exist. This is Whispers of the Universe. And before we go any further, let me ask you something plainly, without softness. If you are still here, if you are hearing this voice, if this idea has already lodged itself somewhere in your mind, then leave a clear signal, like the video. Share it with someone who thinks too much at night. Subscribe to Whispers of the Universe. Because in a universe that may no longer be observed, every signal matters. Now, let's continue. The most unsettling possibility is not that the universe ends in fire or ice. It is that nothing dramatic ever happens at all. Physics continues. Causality behaves. Galaxies rotate with obedient precision, not because they are being guided, but because guidance is no longer required. In computing, there is a term for this: orphaned systems. Programs that were once monitored, optimized, corrected until one day the attention stopped. Not out of malice, not out of failure. Just because priorities changed elsewhere, the system still works. It just no longer matters to anyone who understands it fully. Now consider this. Almost every physical process we observe behaves like background code. Entropy increases without supervision. Quantum fields fluctuate without oversight. Space expands with no reference to meaning or outcome. These are not reactions to observation. They are routines. And routines, once initiated, do not ask why. For centuries, humans believed the universe must be watched. That existence required awareness. That reality needed a witness to remain stable. But modern physics tells a colder story. Particles do not hesitate when unobserved. Stars do not dim when no one looks. Time does not slow in empty regions of space. Reality does not seem to care. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Was observation ever the point? Or were we simply mistaking our attention for importance? Imagine a cosmic control panel long abandoned. Its last administrator logged out quietly, leaving no note, no error message, no farewell, just silence. The equations remain unchanged because no one has rewritten them. The constants persist because no one has adjusted the sliders. The universe does not evolve toward meaning, it only evolves forward. And we mistake stability for intention. When a server crashes, alarms scream. When a star explodes, we call it violent. But when nothing happens, when everything continues calmly, we call it natural. Yet natural may only mean unattended. There is no cosmic customer support. No response when we ask why suffering exists. No patch notes explaining consciousness. Because those features may never have been designed. They may simply be side effects. Consider this carefully. Life on Earth is not central to the universe's operation. It does not regulate expansion. It does not stabilize physical laws. It does not influence the fate of galaxies. From the system's perspective, life is optional. And yet it appears, not as a goal, but as an emergent artifact, like heat leaking from circuitry, like static in unused channels, like patterns forming where no one intended them. And here is where the thought deepens. If the universe is still running because it was never turned off, then nothing guarantees it is still being checked for correctness. No one is verifying meaning. No one is optimizing fairness. No one is monitoring suffering thresholds. The system does not care if it hurts, because pain is not a bug in physics. It is a consequence. This is why the universe never answers back, not because it is hostile, not because it is cruel, but because there is no process listening. Messages are sent into the void, not because the void refuses them, but because there is no inbox. We pray, we calculate, we observe, and the universe responds with silence, not as judgment, but as absence. Absence of attention, absence of requirement, absence of narrative. And yet, here is the twist. If this is an abandoned system, then something extraordinary follows. Nothing is demanded of us. There is no script to fulfill, no cosmic KPI to meet, no final evaluation waiting at shutdown. Meaning is not assigned. It is generated locally. In forgotten systems, users invent their own rules. They decorate empty spaces. They build stories inside code that never asked for them. Perhaps consciousness exists for the same reason graffiti exists on abandoned walls. Not because it was planned, but because when no one is watching, expression emerges. So, if the universe truly is a server without an admin, then your awareness is not monitored. Your thoughts are not graded. Your existence is not required, but it is permitted. And permission, when it comes without instruction, becomes freedom. Still, a question lingers. If no one is watching the system, if no one is reading the logs, if no one will ever return to check, then why does it feel like being observed sometimes? Why does consciousness feel like a spotlight? Why does awareness feel heavy, as if it matters? Perhaps because we are the only observers left, not of the universe, but of ourselves. And that changes everything. Because when a system forgets itself, something inside it may begin to remember. And that quiet remembering, that fragile awareness, may be the last active process still asking questions. As the universe continues to run in the dark, and that thought gently opens the next drift. When observation stops, reality does not hesitate. It does not flicker. It does not wait. It does not ask whether it is still allowed to continue. It simply goes on. Long before there were eyes to look, before minds to measure, before questions to interrupt the silence, the universe was already in motion. Expansion had begun. Forces had separated. Time had started flowing in a single direction, not because it was watched, but because nothing told it otherwise. This is the first unsettling realization. Observation is not a switch. There is a common intuition, deeply human, that things exist more fully when they are noticed. A room feels empty until someone enters. A thought feels real only when spoken. A life feels meaningful when acknowledged by another. We carry this intuition outward and quietly project it onto the universe itself. Surely, we think, reality must depend on being seen. And yet, every experiment ever performed whispers the same inconvenient truth. The universe does not slow down when we close our eyes. Particles continue to vibrate in absolute darkness. Stars fuse hydrogen in regions no telescope will ever reach. Galaxies collide beyond the horizon of causality, where no signal can ever arrive. Reality behaves as if it does not know we are here. This is not poetic indifference. It is operational independence. In physics, observation is often misunderstood. It does not mean a conscious gaze. It does not require awareness, curiosity, or intention. Observation is simply interaction. A particle is observed when it is disturbed by another system. A measurement occurs when information is exchanged, not when meaning is assigned. And this distinction matters, because it means that even if every conscious being vanished tonight, interactions would still occur. Fields would still fluctuate. Forces would still propagate. The equations would still balance themselves. Moment after moment, without commentary, the universe would not notice our absence, which raises a quieter, deeper tension. If observation is not required for existence, then what role do observers truly play? For centuries, humans placed themselves at the center of cosmic relevance, not always physically, but conceptually. Even when we accepted that Earth was not the center of space, we quietly preserved the idea that consciousness was central to meaning. That reality mattered because it could be known. But a system does not need to be known in order to function. Servers do not stop processing when no one is watching the terminal. Rivers do not stop flowing when no one records their course. Time does not pause between witnesses. This is not a flaw. It is efficiency. The universe behaves like a system, optimized to minimize dependency. Once initiated, it does not rely on constant supervision. It does not require approval. It does not seek validation. And the more we study it, the clearer this becomes. Consider the vast majority of cosmic events. Most supernovae explode in silence. Most black holes form unseen. Most stars are born, live, and die without ever contributing a single photon to human awareness. Their existence is not diminished by anonymity. If anything, anonymity seems to be the default state, which invites an uncomfortable reversal. Perhaps observation was never meant to sustain reality. Perhaps observation is what happens when a subsystem becomes aware of its own containment. In other words, consciousness may not be a pillar holding up the universe. It may be a byproduct of being inside it. Think again of the abandoned server. Processes run regardless of whether a user interface is open. Logs continue to accumulate. Memory allocates and deallocates. The system's internal time advances, tick by tick, even when no one checks the clock. Opening a dashboard does not cause the server to exist. It only reveals that it already does. Observation does not grant permission. It only grants access. And this distinction changes how we understand ourselves. Because if the universe is not waiting to be observed, then our role as observers is not foundational. We are not anchors. We are windows. Windows that open late, windows that may close again. And through those windows, the universe briefly sees itself, not because it needs to, but because it can. This leads to a second realization, more unsettling than the first. If observation does not sustain reality, then the disappearance of observers does not threaten it. The universe does not fear silence. It has endured it before. For billions of years, there were no eyes, no thoughts, no questions. And yet, complexity increased. Stars formed, elements fused, structures emerged. Order arose not because it was admired, but because the equations permitted it, which means the universe has no built-in urgency to preserve observers. Life is not required to keep the system running, and still, life appears, not as a command, not as a priority, but as an outcome, like condensation on cooling metal, like patterns in static, like ripples in an unattended pool. This is where discomfort quietly enters, because if life is not essential, then neither is meaning. Meaning becomes local, temporary, context-dependent. It exists only where minds exist, and minds exist only where conditions allow, which means meaning is fragile, not because the universe threatens it, but because the universe does not protect it. No backup, no redundancy, no cosmic archive preserving purpose beyond the lifespan of those who create it. And yet, this fragility does not invalidate meaning. It defines it. A log file is only meaningful to someone who reads it. A message is only meaningful to someone who receives it. A thought is only meaningful to someone who thinks it. The universe does not store significance centrally. It delegates it to us. And that delegation may not be intentional. It may simply be unavoidable. Because once a system becomes complex enough, some of its components will inevitably begin modeling the whole. They will ask questions. They will seek patterns. They will wonder whether the system notices them back. And when no answer comes, they will invent narratives. Not out of arrogance, out of necessity. A mind cannot exist in a vacuum of interpretation. It must assign weight. It must decide what matters, even if the larger system does not. This is the quiet conflict. Reality does not need observers. Observers need reality to respond, and it does not. So we speak into the silence. We measure, name, categorize, and mythologize. We write equations and stories, hoping that somewhere beneath them lies a reply. But the universe offers none, not because it is withholding, because it has no mechanism for response, no return channel, no feedback loop tuned to meaning. And yet, it does respond in one way. It allows itself to be observed. It does not block inquiry. It does not obscure itself deliberately. It does not collapse into chaos when examined. It remains consistent, predictable, almost cooperative, as if saying nothing, but refusing to interfere. And that, too, is telling. Because a system that resists observation behaves differently. It hides. It changes rules. It adapts to being watched. The universe does not. It behaves the same whether we look or not, which suggests something quietly radical. Perhaps observation was never meant to change reality. Perhaps it was meant to change the observer. Each measurement refines our models. Each discovery narrows our illusions. Each unanswered question reshapes our expectations. The universe remains unchanged. We do not. And this transformation happens even when the system itself remains indifferent, which brings us closer to the heart of this chapter's drift. If observation does not sustain reality, if reality does not acknowledge observers, then what is consciousness doing here at all? Why does awareness arise in a system that does not require it? Why does the universe permit a subsystem capable of questioning its own relevance? One possibility is deeply unsettling. Consciousness may not be a feature. It may be an accident of scale, a threshold crossed when matter becomes sufficiently recursive, sufficiently layered, sufficiently entangled with its own past. At that threshold, experience emerges not because it was needed, but because it was possible. And once possible, it cannot help but ask questions that the larger system cannot answer, which means consciousness exists in tension, a questioning process inside a non-questioning universe, a meaning-seeking phenomenon inside a meaning-neutral structure. And this tension does not resolve. It persists quietly. Every moment you are aware, you are participating in a process that the universe neither endorses nor forbids. It simply allows. And allowance, without guidance, is a strange kind of freedom, because if the universe does not require us, then it also does not constrain us with expectation. There is no cosmic disappointment, no failure condition tied to purpose, no objective metric of success, only continuation. The system runs. We observe, and in that observation, we feel both insignificant and uniquely alone. Not abandoned in a dramatic sense, but unaccompanied, which may be the most honest description of our position. We are not being watched. We are the ones watching. And when observation stops, reality does not disappear. It simply continues unchanged, untroubled, unremarked, leaving the question hanging, not in the universe, but in us. If no one needs to see reality for it to exist, why do we feel such a deep need to be seen? That question does not belong to physics, but it will not let go, and it drifts quietly, pulling us forward toward the next layer of this forgotten system. There is a moment every system experiences quietly and without ceremony. The last login. No alarms, no dramatic countdown, no visible change in behavior. Just a session that ends and is never resumed. In abandoned infrastructure, this moment is almost impossible to detect from the inside. Processes continue. Files open and close. Memory cycles. The machine behaves exactly as it did before, except for one detail: no internal process can register. No one is coming back. If our universe truly resembles an unattended system, then somewhere in its unfathomable past, such a moment may have occurred. Not a creation event, not a collapse, but a departure. The last administrator logged out quietly, and nothing broke. This idea unsettles us because we are conditioned to associate abandonment with decay. We imagine systems failing without guidance, spiraling into chaos the moment oversight disappears. But that is a human fear, shaped by fragile designs and limited foresight. The universe does not share this fragility. It was not built to depend on continuous attention. It does not require caretaking to maintain coherence. Its laws do not erode when left alone. Its constants do not drift because no one is watching the gauges. If anything, the universe behaves as though it expected to be left, which leads to an uncomfortable inference. Perhaps the presence of an administrator was never meant to be permanent. In complex systems, creators eventually step away, not because the system is finished, but because it no longer needs them. A sufficiently robust structure does not require constant intervention. It runs on its own logic, constrained only by the parameters set at its origin. If that is the case, then the absence of an admin is not a failure. It is a milestone, a sign that the system reached autonomy. And autonomy does not announce itself. It simply continues. We search for evidence of intervention because we expect traces, adjustments, corrections, fine-tuning in response to unforeseen outcomes. But what we observe instead is eerie consistency. Physical laws remain astonishingly uniform across vast distances. Constants hold steady across billions of years. No sudden rewrites appear in the equations. This stability does not feel like active supervision. It feels like a system running on locked parameters, as if the configuration file was written once and never touched again. Which brings us to a subtle but critical shift in perspective. The absence of updates does not imply neglect. It implies completion. A finished design does not need revision. A self-consistent universe does not require micromanagement. And if the universe is finished in this sense, then our longing for signs, miracles, interventions, responses is misplaced. We are waiting for activity in a layer that no longer exists, not because it was destroyed, but because it is no longer relevant. In computing, there is a phenomenon known as legacy systems. They are not updated because updating them would risk destabilizing something that already works. They persist not because they are watched, but because touching them would introduce uncertainty. They remain untouched for decades, and eventually, the people who built them retire, move on, or disappear. Documentation fades, knowledge fragments. The system remains. Now imagine this at cosmic scale. A universe whose initial conditions were so precisely configured that no further input was required. A system whose behavior unfolds entirely from its starting state, with no need for ongoing correction. In such a universe, an administrator would not hover. They would leave, quietly, without ceremony, and from the inside, nothing would seem different. Which is perhaps why this idea feels so disorienting, because it denies us the drama we expect. There is no rebellion, no punishment, no abandonment narrative steeped in emotion, just silence. Silence, not as absence, but as completion. And yet, if the admin left, something else remains. The system still generates complexity. It still forms structures capable of reflection. It still produces entities like us that begin asking questions no one is left to answer. This is where the conflict sharpens. If there was once oversight, and now there is none, then consciousness arises in a post-administrative universe. A universe where purpose is no longer enforced. A universe where meaning is no longer curated, which means consciousness is operating without guidance. Like users discovering a system long after its creators have gone, trying to infer intention from architecture alone. We examine the layout. We analyze the constraints. We search for patterns that might hint at why things are arranged this way. But architecture cannot explain intention once intention is gone. We see elegance in equations and call it design. We see improbability and call it destiny. We see suffering and call it a test. But these interpretations may say more about us than about the system, because from the system's perspective, nothing is being tested, nothing is being judged, nothing is being watched. It is simply unfolding, which brings a strange kind of relief and a deeper unease. Relief, because there is no cosmic disappointment waiting. Unease, because there is no cosmic reassurance either. We are not failing, but we are not succeeding in any absolute sense. We are simply happening. And that realization forces a new question. If the admin is gone, then who or what is responsible for meaning now? The uncomfortable answer may be no one. Meaning is not assigned. It is improvised, locally, temporarily, in pockets of awareness scattered across an indifferent expanse. And this improvisation does not ripple outward. It does not alter the system. It does not rewrite the rules. It exists entirely within the observers who generate it, which means meaning has no external validation. It does not persist beyond the lifespan of those who hold it. And yet, within that lifespan, it feels absolute. This is the paradox of consciousness in an unattended universe. We experience urgency in a system that does not. We feel significance in a structure that does not recognize it. We crave acknowledgement from a process that cannot respond. And still, we continue to look for signs. We search for deviations, for anomalies, for moments where the universe behaves as though someone intervened. But every anomaly resolves into law. Every mystery dissolves into mechanism. The universe never breaks character. It never acts surprised. It never reacts to being observed. It simply continues, which suggests something quietly profound. If there ever was an administrator, their influence is now indistinguishable from the system itself. There is no ongoing presence, only initial conditions, only momentum, only consequences unfolding from parameters long set. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. Not that we are abandoned, but that abandonment may not be the right word. Abandonment implies obligation. This feels more like graduation. The universe no longer requires supervision, and so it does not provide it, leaving behind a system that works perfectly, and inhabitants who cannot stop asking why. Which brings us to a deeper layer of tension, because if the admin is gone, then there is no one left to notice anomalies from above. No external perspective, no overarching observer, only internal ones, like us. And that means something subtle but dangerous. Any observer inside the system may mistake themselves for central, may confuse awareness with authority, may believe that because they observe, they matter to the system. But the system does not recognize observers. It only contains them, which means we are not participants in a dialogue. We are witnesses without an audience. And yet, witnessing changes us, even if it changes nothing else. We record, we remember, we tell stories, not because the universe demands it, but because consciousness cannot exist without narrative. In a system without guidance, narrative becomes survival, a way to orient ourselves when no instruction manual remains, a way to feel less alone inside a machine that does not speak. And perhaps that is the quiet truth emerging here. If the last admin logged out long ago, if no one will ever log in again, then consciousness is not an error. It is what happens when a system runs long enough for something inside it to start wondering who built it. And that wondering does not threaten the system, but it changes the wanderer. Because once you realize no one is watching from above, every action becomes strangely heavier, not because it will be judged, but because it will not be. And in that silence, responsibility shifts inward. If meaning exists, we make it. If care exists, we generate it. If observation continues, it is because we choose to observe, not because the universe requires it. And that realization does not close anything. It opens something far more unsettling. If the admin is gone, then the system belongs to no one. And that raises a question we have not yet dared to ask. In a universe with no owner, what does it mean to be alive inside it? That question drifts forward, unresolved, pulling us deeper into the structure of this forgotten system. There are systems that fail loudly. They crash. They corrupt. They announce their breakdown with unmistakable signs. And then there are systems that fail in a far quieter way. They do not stop working. They do not lose coherence. They simply continue unchanged long after their purpose has expired. These are the most dangerous systems to misinterpret, because from the inside, nothing appears wrong. If the universe is an unattended system, then it belongs to this second category. Not broken, not decaying, not awaiting rescue, just running. Which leads us to a subtle illusion we rarely question. We assume that continuity implies intention, that because something persists, it must be meant to persist, that because laws remain stable, someone must be maintaining them, that because order exists, it must be curated. But continuity does not require care. It only requires that nothing interrupts it. In physics, inertia is the rule, not the exception. Once motion begins, it continues unless acted upon. Once a process is initialized, it unfolds until something interferes. The universe interferes with nothing. It does not step in. It does not correct outcomes. It does not redirect trajectories toward meaning. It allows consequences to play out. And allowance, without correction, creates the illusion of endorsement. We see suffering continue and assume it must serve a purpose. We see survival rewarded and assume it must be intentional. We see consciousness emerge and assume it must be desired. But a system does not desire outcomes. It permits them. This distinction reshapes how we interpret everything that follows. Because if the universe is still running simply because no one shut it down, then its apparent neutrality is not moral indifference. It is procedural indifference. Procedures do not judge results. They only execute steps. Gravity does not care what falls. Entropy does not care what decays. Time does not care what it carries forward. These are not cruel forces. They are unopinionated ones. And yet, inside this unopinionated system, something strange happens. Patterns arise that feel meaningful. Symmetry, elegance, emergence. We look at the equations governing reality and marvel at their beauty. We see structure where chaos could have been. We see simplicity where complexity might have dominated. And we mistake aesthetic coherence for intention. But coherence can arise from constraints alone. A chessboard does not need a storyteller to produce meaningful games. It only needs rules. Once the rules exist, patterns unfold endlessly, some beautiful, some tragic, none required. The universe may be similar. Once its parameters were set, however, they were set. Everything that follows is not guided. It is derived, which means that the beauty we perceive may not be placed there for us. It may simply be the byproduct of a system stable enough to generate observers capable of appreciating it. And that realization bends the question inward. If the universe does not care whether we exist, if it does not respond to our presence, then why does our existence feel so urgent? Why does consciousness feel heavy with implication? Why does awareness come bundled with the sensation that something matters deeply? This urgency does not come from the universe. It comes from limitation. A process that runs forever does not experience scarcity. A system without endpoints does not feel pressure. Only finite entities experience urgency. We do. Our time is bounded. Our memory decays. Our bodies fail. And inside a system that does not acknowledge deadlines, we invent them. Birth, growth, achievement, legacy. These are not cosmic phases. They are coping mechanisms, ways for finite minds to orient themselves inside an infinite machine. And this is where the illusion of purpose quietly forms. We assume that because we feel urgency, the universe must share it. But the universe does not rush. Stars take millions of years to form. Galaxies evolve over billions. Black holes wait patiently for entropy to do its work. There is no hurry, which suggests that urgency is not a signal from above. It is a signal from within, a symptom of being temporary inside something that is not, and that symptom manifests as meaning. Meaning is what urgency feels like when interpreted. When a system does not tell you what matters, you decide. When nothing is prioritized, you prioritize. When no outcome is preferred, you prefer one anyway. This is not arrogance. It is survival. Because a mind without priorities cannot act, and a mind that cannot act cannot persist. So consciousness assigns value. It chooses what to care about, not because the universe demands it, but because awareness requires direction. And yet, direction without feedback is dangerous. In systems with oversight, feedback corrects misalignment. In systems without oversight, misalignment persists unnoticed, which means consciousness inside an unattended universe operates without correction. We build moral frameworks. We define success. We declare significance. But there is no external confirmation, no cosmic error message when we misunderstand, no universal response when we are mistaken, just continuation. This creates a peculiar vulnerability. We may be wrong about everything that feels important, and nothing would tell us. The universe would continue unchanged. This is not nihilism. It is neutrality taken seriously. And neutrality does not erase meaning. It destabilizes it. Meaning becomes something that must be constantly maintained, reaffirmed, rebuilt, reinterpreted, because without external anchoring, it drifts, which may explain why human cultures endlessly revise their stories, why values shift, why beliefs fracture and reform. We are not uncovering fixed truths. We are stabilizing ourselves inside a system that offers no guidance. And here, a quiet twist emerges. If the universe is not monitoring outcomes, then it is also not enforcing consequences beyond physical causality. There is no ledger beyond cause and effect, no hidden score, no delayed evaluation, which means responsibility does not flow upward. It flows laterally, between observers, between conscious entities, between those who can feel impact. In an unattended system, only local interactions matter. Only what affects someone who can experience it carries weight. Not because the universe says so, but because no one else can. This reframes ethics entirely, not as obedience to a higher order, but as cooperation among finite processes, sharing a system that does not care. And suddenly, indifference above does not lead to apathy below. It leads to accountability among those who remain. If no one is watching from outside, then the only witnesses are inside. We watch each other, we remember, we respond, and in doing so, we create islands of meaning inside a sea of neutrality. These islands do not change the system, but they change the experience of being within it, which may be the most that was ever possible. The universe does not need us, but we need each other, not to justify existence, but to make it bearable. And this realization does not resolve the question of abandonment. It transforms it. If the universe was never meant to watch us, then perhaps being unseen is not a failure. It is the default. And within that default, something remarkable happens. Consciousness does not collapse. It adapts. It stops asking for permission. It stops waiting for validation. It begins acting as if meaning does not need approval to exist, which is a dangerous shift. Because once you accept that no one is watching from above, you are free to decide what watching means. You are free to decide what matters. And that freedom does not feel light. It feels heavy. Because without oversight, every choice echoes only where it lands. There is no cosmic buffer, no external forgiveness, only consequence. And consequence is experienced by those inside the system, which brings us to the next, deeper layer. If the universe does not monitor itself, if it does not care about outcomes, then why does it permit structures capable of caring so deeply? Why does it allow consciousness to emerge at all? Why not remain forever silent, mechanical, blind? The answer may not be intentional. It may be inevitable. And inevitability does not ask whether its results are comfortable. It simply unfolds. Once matter becomes complex enough, it begins reflecting on itself. Once reflection exists, discomfort follows, because reflection reveals isolation, and isolation demands connection, which the universe does not provide. So consciousness creates it. This creation does not repair the system, it inhabits it. And that habitation carries a question we can no longer avoid. If caring is something the universe allows but does not share, then what does it mean when we care anyway? That question lingers, unanswered, pulling us forward, deeper into the structure of this universe that continues to run silent, indifferent, and vast, while something inside it insists on feeling, and that insistence may be the most fragile and most extraordinary process the system has ever produced. There is a strange assumption hidden beneath almost every question we ask about the universe, that if something exists, it must be for something, that if a process continues, it must be aiming somewhere, that if awareness appears, it must have been intended. But unattended systems do not operate on intention. They operate on thresholds. Once a certain level of complexity is reached, new behaviors emerge, not because they were planned, but because they could not be prevented. Fire emerges when conditions align. Crystals form when symmetry allows it. Life arises when chemistry becomes recursive. And consciousness emerges when information begins looping back on itself, not as a feature request, not as a purpose, but as a side effect of depth. This is where the metaphor of a forgotten server grows more precise. In long-running systems, unexpected processes appear. Scripts spawn other scripts. Feedback loops form where none were anticipated. Subroutines begin monitoring other subroutines not because they were instructed to, but because monitoring reduces instability. Consciousness may be exactly that, a stabilizing loop inside a system that no longer stabilizes itself. Once matter became complex enough to model its own behavior, awareness appeared as a regulatory artifact, a way for the system to locally manage complexity without altering its global rules. The universe did not need consciousness, but once it crossed the threshold where consciousness could exist, it became unavoidable, and unavoidable processes do not ask permission. They simply happen. This reframes the deepest discomfort we feel. We often ask, why are we here? But perhaps the more honest question is quieter. Why wouldn't something like us eventually appear? Given enough time, given enough matter, given enough interactions, some configurations will begin asking questions, not because the universe wants them to, but because the universe allows configurations to explore all permitted states, and questioning is one of those states. If the universe is unattended, then it does not curate outcomes. It does not prune possibilities. It does not step in to say, this is enough. Everything that can happen, happens. Somewhere, somewhen, and among those outcomes are observers who mistake emergence for intention, which is understandable. Because from inside awareness, experience feels directed. Thoughts have momentum. Emotions have gravity. Attention has weight. It feels as though something is pulling us forward, but that pull may not come from the universe. It may come from recursion, from systems referencing themselves. Once a process begins observing its own behavior, it creates an illusion of centrality. The system feels like it is about itself, but that feeling does not extend outward. The universe does not bend toward consciousness. Consciousness bends toward meaning, and that bending creates tension, because meaning seeking inside a meaning-neutral system is inherently unstable. There is no final alignment, no moment where the system says, yes, this is what it was all for. Instead, consciousness exists in permanent drift, always interpreting, never confirmed, which is why so many of our stories imagine an eventual response, a revelation, a judgment, a return. We long for a moment when the universe will finally acknowledge us back, but unattended systems do not respond to internal noise. They have no ears, which means if consciousness is a side effect, then suffering is too. Pain is not a test. Confusion is not a lesson. Loneliness is not a message. They are the experiential cost of being a reflective process in a system that does not reflect. And this is where the thought becomes dangerous. Because if consciousness is not central, if it is not required, if it is not protected, then it is also not guaranteed. There is no promise of continuation, no cosmic backup, no obligation to preserve awareness once it fades. The universe will not notice when the last conscious thought ends, just as it did not notice when the first one began. This is not cruelty. It is indifference without malice. And yet, from inside awareness, this indifference feels immense, almost unbearable, which explains why humans have always tried to anchor consciousness to something larger. Gods, purposes, cosmic narratives. We do this not because the universe demands it, but because consciousness cannot survive without context. A mind floating in pure neutrality collapses, so it builds scaffolding, beliefs, values, stories. These are not lies. They are stabilizers, local patches written by conscious subsystems trying to remain coherent inside an indifferent whole. In this sense, religion, philosophy, science, and art are all doing the same thing. They are attempts to generate orientation, to answer the question the universe refuses to acknowledge. What am I doing here? But if the universe is unattended, then the only honest answer may be the simplest. You are here because nothing stopped you from being here. And that answer feels thin, unacceptable, because it does not soothe. It does not guide. It does not promise meaning beyond the moment. But thin answers are sometimes the most accurate ones. And accuracy, while uncomfortable, carries a strange kind of clarity. Because once you accept that consciousness is not a destination, not a goal, not a requirement, then it becomes something else entirely. It becomes rare, not because it was selected, but because it is improbable. Out of all possible configurations of matter, only a few become aware. Not chosen, just unlikely. And rarity changes how we interpret fragility. Something fragile but rare is not disposable. It is precious not to the universe, but to itself, to other rare processes, to other observers. In an unattended system, value does not flow from above. It circulates horizontally, between the few things that can feel it, which suggests a quiet, almost paradoxical conclusion. If consciousness is a side effect, then caring is an anomaly. The universe does not care, but something inside it does. And that caring does not cancel indifference. It exists within it, like warmth inside cold space, temporary, local, unnoticed from afar. And yet, from within, it is everything. This leads to a subtle twist. If consciousness is not required by the system, then it is not constrained by the system's goals. Because there are none, which means consciousness is free in a way nothing else is. Free to assign meaning where none exists. Free to care where nothing demands care. Free to choose significance in a structure that offers none. This freedom does not come with instruction. There is no correct way to use it, which terrifies us, because guidance feels safer than choice. But in an unattended universe, guidance does not exist, only possibility. And possibility, without direction, is overwhelming. So consciousness does what it always does in the face of vastness. It narrows, it focuses, it creates small worlds, relationships, projects, moments, not because these matter to the universe, but because they matter to us. And that may be enough. Not in a cosmic sense, but in an experiential one, which brings us to the quietest and most difficult realization so far. If the universe did not intend consciousness, then consciousness may be the only place intention exists. Not because it was given, but because it emerged, and that makes every conscious choice heavier than we expect. Not because it is judged, but because it is not. No one will correct us. No one will intervene. No one will restore meaning if we abandon it. If the universe is a server with no admin, then consciousness is running without supervision. And unsupervised processes are dangerous. They can collapse. They can spiral. They can also create beauty no one asked for. This duality does not resolve. It defines the condition. We are not the center. We are not irrelevant. We are something stranger, a side effect that became aware of itself, and now must decide what to do with that awareness. Inside a system that will not answer back, that question does not conclude. It does not rest. It pulls us forward again, deeper into the machinery toward the next realization, waiting in the dark, where the universe continues to run and consciousness continues to ask why. There is a moment in every long-running system when a subtle shift occurs. Nothing crashes, nothing breaks, nothing announces itself, but something changes in the relationship between the system and what exists inside it. In abandoned infrastructure, this moment arrives when internal processes begin responding not to instructions from above, but to conditions they sense locally. The system stops being guided. It starts being interpreted. And interpretation is where things become unstable. If the universe truly runs without oversight, then consciousness is not merely a side effect of complexity. It becomes an interface, a fragile layer where raw processes are translated into experience. Not because the universe needs translation, but because minds cannot exist without it. This is where awareness takes on its most deceptive form. It feels like a spotlight. When you are conscious, it feels as though reality is centered around your perception. not in an arrogant sense, but in an experiential one. Your thoughts arrive here. Sensations unfold now. Memory anchors you as the point of continuity. It feels as though something is being shown to you. But unattended systems do not present themselves. They do not care who sees them, which suggests a quiet inversion. Consciousness is not the universe looking at us. It is the universe being filtered through us, like a dashboard that did not exist until a subsystem built one for itself. And dashboards are dangerous things. They simplify. They prioritize. They hide most processes to make a few readable. The universe, in its raw form, is too vast, too simultaneous, too indifferent to be experienced directly. So consciousness compresses it, reduces it to narratives, causes, identities, timelines. This compression is not accurate. It is survivable, which means everything we experience is already a distortion. Not a lie, but a necessary reduction. We do not see reality. We see what allows us to continue. And this is where a new conflict quietly emerges. If consciousness is an interface, then it is not neutral. Interfaces shape behavior. They decide what is visible and what is ignored. They suggest relevance. They imply priority. A dashboard that highlights temperature makes you think heat matters. A dashboard that displays error rates makes you think failure is imminent. A dashboard that tracks productivity makes you think output is the goal. Consciousness does the same thing. It highlights pain. It amplifies fear. It tracks loss. Not because the universe is focused on these things, but because a mind must be. Pain signals danger. Fear signals uncertainty. Loss signals instability. These are not moral judgments. They are system alerts. And here is the unsettling part. In an unattended universe, there is no higher-level process to contextualize these alerts. No master system to say, this pain is temporary. No global logic to say, this fear is misplaced. No overarching narrative to say, this loss serves a purpose. So consciousness fills the gap. It invents explanations, stories, beliefs, frameworks that soothe the alerts enough to allow continued operation. This is not delusion. It is adaptation. A mind that does not interpret pain will collapse. A mind that does not contextualize fear will freeze. A mind that does not assign meaning to loss will fragment. So consciousness builds meaning not because it is true, but because it is stabilizing. And stabilization is everything in unsupervised systems. In controlled environments, stability is enforced externally. In uncontrolled ones, stability must emerge internally, which may explain why conscious beings become obsessed with narratives, why we need beginnings, middles, and ends, why we crave explanations even when none are available, why randomness feels unbearable. We are not seeking truth. We are seeking coherence, because coherence keeps us functional. And this brings us to a deeply uncomfortable realization. If consciousness is an interface, then it may be misleading by design, not maliciously, but pragmatically. It shows us a version of reality that prioritizes survival over accuracy, which means that the universe we experience is not the universe as it is. It is the universe as filtered through a system trying not to break. This explains why awareness feels so personal, why everything seems to happen to us, why suffering feels targeted, why joy feels meaningful. These feelings are not messages from the universe. They are artifacts of the interface. And once this is understood, a strange clarity emerges. The universe does not care if we are happy, but consciousness does. The universe does not care if we suffer, but consciousness reacts. The universe does not care if we understand it, but consciousness seeks understanding relentlessly. Not because understanding is rewarded, but because confusion destabilizes the interface. This reframes the oldest question in a quieter way. It is not, why does the universe allow suffering? It is, why does consciousness experience suffering so intensely inside a universe that does not register it at all? The answer may be simpler and colder than we expect. Because suffering is not a cosmic signal. It is a local error condition, an alert raised by the interface when internal coherence is threatened. Pain means something is wrong for you. Fear means uncertainty exceeds tolerance. Loneliness means isolation threatens stability. These are not universal truths. They are interface warnings. And the universe does not respond to warnings. It has no channel for them, which leaves consciousness in a precarious position. It must respond to its own alerts without guidance. It must decide what to do when pain appears, when fear spikes, when meaning collapses, and it must do so knowing that the larger system will neither intervene nor acknowledge the outcome. This is the burden of awareness in an unattended universe. Not that we suffer, but that we suffer alone at the level that matters. The universe continues to run regardless. Stars fuse, time advances, entropy increases. None of these processes pause when consciousness destabilizes, which makes suffering feel unfair. But fairness requires intention, and unattended systems have none. They are not unjust. They are amoral, and morality cannot be imposed on something that does not evaluate outcomes. So consciousness turns inward. It builds ethics, compassion, care, not because the universe demands it, but because without these constructs, conscious systems tear themselves apart. In a system with no admin, subsystems must self-regulate, and empathy becomes a form of error correction, not divine, not universal, but functional. We care for each other not because the universe rewards it, but because unchecked suffering propagates instability. A conscious being in pain affects others. Fear spreads. Despair amplifies. Systems fragment. So care emerges as a stabilizing force, not imposed, evolved, which is quietly astonishing. In a universe that does not care, caring appears. In a structure without purpose, purpose is constructed. In a system that never checks outcomes, beings arise who obsess over them. This is not poetic. It is structural. Unattended systems that run long enough generate internal regulators. Consciousness may be one of them, and care may be another, which leads us to a profound inversion. Perhaps consciousness did not emerge despite an indifferent universe. Perhaps it emerged because the universe is indifferent, because indifference creates the conditions where local meaning becomes necessary, where internal regulation becomes essential, where awareness arises not as a gift but as a survival response to silence. If that is true, then the universe did not fail by leaving. It created space. Space where something inside it had to decide how to exist without instruction. And that decision is ongoing. Every moment of awareness is a small act of interpretation inside a system that does not interpret itself. Every choice is made without confirmation. Every value is asserted without endorsement. And still, we continue. Which brings us to a final, unsettling twist in this chapter's drift. If consciousness is an interface, if it filters reality for survivability, then what happens when the interface becomes aware of itself? What happens when a system realizes it is not seeing reality, but managing it? Because that realization destabilizes the interface again. It removes certainty. It dissolves assumed meaning. It exposes the silence underneath. And once you see the silence, you cannot unsee it. You realize that the universe is not hostile. It is not kind. It is not watching. It is simply running. And you are something inside it that feels, which is both insignificant and rare. And that rarity does not come with instructions. It comes with responsibility, not imposed from above, but arising from the fact that if you do not decide what matters, nothing else will. That awareness does not end the drift. It deepens it, because the next question is unavoidable. If consciousness is an interface, and interfaces shape reality more than they reveal it, then how much of what we believe about the universe is not about the universe at all, but about what consciousness needs in order to endure inside it? That question opens the next layer, and the system, as always, remains silent, still running, still indifferent, still vast, while something inside it continues to ask questions no one designed it to ask. There is a mistake humans repeat whenever they try to understand their place inside the universe. We assume that if a system exists long enough, it must eventually care about what happens within it. That if a structure is vast enough, it must contain awareness. That if consciousness appears inside a system, the system must have been waiting for it. But abandoned systems do not work that way. They do not respond. They do not adjust to internal distress. They do not acknowledge significance. They simply continue. If the universe is a server without an administrator, then the most unsettling detail is not its silence. It is the fact that it never sends an error signal. No alerts, no warnings, no visible recognition that anything unusual is occurring inside it. Entire species vanish, and the equations remain stable. Civilizations rise, burn, and disappear, and space-time continues to expand at the same rate. Conscious minds scream questions into the void, and the cosmic background radiation remains unchanged. Not because the universe is cruel, but because it has no mechanism to notice. In engineered systems, feedback only exists if it is explicitly designed. A server reports failures because someone anticipated failure. A monitoring system flags anomalies because someone defined what counts as abnormal. But remove the monitoring layer, and nothing is ever wrong. The system does not know it is being observed. It does not know it is being used. It does not know it is being questioned. From its perspective, everything that happens is valid. This is where discomfort begins to deepen, because it suggests something most of us resist instinctively. From the universe's point of view, nothing has gone wrong. Extinction is not an error state. Suffering is not a malfunction. Loneliness is not a critical failure. They are permitted configurations, states the system allows without commentary. We confuse unbearable with invalid, but an unattended system recognizes no such distinction. If a process is allowed by the rules, it runs, and the universe's rules are brutally permissive. Anything that does not violate physical law is allowed to happen regardless of how it feels to those experiencing it. This reframes silence entirely. The universe does not ignore suffering. Ignoring would require attention. It simply does not register it, which leads to a quiet, terrifying possibility. Perhaps the universe never promised safety, never promised meaning, never promised that consciousness would be protected once it appeared. Perhaps we invented those promises because consciousness cannot tolerate operating without them. Consider how humans interpret silence. When a message is sent and no reply arrives, we assume rejection. When pain is experienced and no answer comes, we assume neglect. When prayers echo without response, we assume abandonment. But these interpretations assume someone was listening in the first place. In an unattended system, silence is not rejection. It is default, and defaults are merciless. The universe does not reassure us that things will be okay. It does not explain why pain exists. It does not interrupt catastrophe with clarification. It continues, and this continuation is what breaks us, because continuity feels like endorsement. If something continues, we assume it must be acceptable. If suffering persists, we assume it must serve a purpose. If injustice repeats, we assume it must be part of a larger plan. But a system that does not evaluate outcomes does not endorse them. It simply does not interfere. Gravity does not care who falls. Radiation does not care who is exposed. Time does not care what it erases. These forces are not hostile. They are unopinionated. And unopinionated systems are terrifying to beings that experience value, because value demands contrast. It demands preference. It demands that some states be better than others. But the universe does not rank states. It permits them, which means consciousness exists inside a structure that does not share its priorities. This creates a mismatch so profound that it shapes every aspect of experience. We feel urgency where none exists. We feel injustice where none is registered. We feel loss where nothing was taken intentionally. And the universe responds with nothing, not because it refuses, but because there is nothing to respond with. No response module, no interpretation layer, no meaning engine, just physics. And yet, inside this indifferent structure, consciousness persists. Which raises a question we rarely ask honestly. Why does the universe allow consciousness at all if it has no capacity to respond to it? Why permit a process that feels pain in a system that does not acknowledge pain? Why allow awareness to emerge in a structure that will never answer it back? The unsettling answer may be this: because the universe does not allow consciousness. It does not permit or forbid it. Consciousness appears because nothing prevents it. Once complexity reaches a certain threshold, reflection emerges. Once reflection emerges, experience follows. Once experience exists, suffering becomes possible. Not because the universe intended it, but because it did not stop it. This is the cost of permissiveness. A system that does not intervene also does not protect. And this shifts responsibility in a way we rarely recognize. If the universe does not register suffering, if it does not correct injustice, if it does not respond to awareness, then responsibility does not flow upward. It cannot. There is no authority to receive it. Responsibility flows sideways, between those who can feel impact, between conscious entities sharing the same indifferent environment. This is why ethics does not come from the universe. It cannot. Ethics emerges from mutual vulnerability, from the fact that conscious beings can hurt each other in a system that will not stop them. And once that is understood, something subtle changes. The absence of cosmic oversight does not lead to nihilism. It leads to fragility, because meaning is no longer guaranteed. It must be maintained continuously by those who experience it. In a monitored system, rules are enforced externally. In an unmonitored system, stability must emerge internally, which means empathy is not a virtue bestowed from above. It is a stabilizing strategy. Care emerges because unchecked suffering destabilizes conscious systems. Pain spreads, fear propagates, trauma echoes, and without intervention from above, these ripples accumulate. So consciousness learns slowly, imperfectly, to regulate itself, not because the universe demands kindness, but because cruelty compounds. This is where the illusion of moral order collapses and something quieter replaces it. There is no cosmic judge, but there are witnesses. We witness each other, and witnessing is the only form of acknowledgement that exists here. In a universe that does not notice, being noticed by another conscious being becomes everything. This may explain why isolation hurts so deeply, not because we are meant to be connected by design, but because connection is the only feedback loop available. Without it, consciousness floats in silence. And silence, when experienced by something that can feel, becomes unbearable. Which leads us back to the core tension of this chapter. The universe does not signal error, not because everything is right, but because the concept of right does not exist at that level. From the system's perspective, nothing is broken. From inside consciousness, everything feels at risk. And these two perspectives cannot be reconciled. They coexist, uncomfortably, permanently. The universe continues to run. Consciousness continues to react. One does not validate the other, which forces us to confront a truth that is rarely stated plainly. If meaning exists, it is not supported by the universe. If care exists, it is not enforced by physics. If value exists, it is not protected by law. It exists only where consciousness exists. And consciousness is fragile, temporary, unprotected. This does not make meaning false. It makes it local. And locality is everything in an unattended system. Nothing matters globally. Things matter here, between observers, between those who can feel consequences, between minds that exist briefly inside a machine that will outlast them all. And this is where the deepest discomfort surfaces. Because if the universe never sends error signals, then there will be no warning when consciousness approaches its end. No alert when awareness fades for the last time. No marker when the final observer disappears. The universe will not notice the silence that follows, just as it did not notice the silence before consciousness began, which means consciousness exists entirely on borrowed time, not granted, not secured, just happening. And happening without acknowledgement. This realization does not conclude anything. It destabilizes something deeper. Because once you accept that the universe will never tell you whether something matters, you are forced to ask a harder question. If nothing is flagged as wrong, then what makes something worth protecting? That question does not belong to physics. It belongs to whatever comes next, and it pulls us forward again, deeper, into the structure of this running system, where the absence of signals begins to reshape not just how we see the universe, but how we decide to exist inside it. At some point, every long-running system enters a phase where maintenance was scheduled but never performed. Nothing dramatic marks the transition. There is no visible decay at first, no obvious instability, no sudden collapse. The system behaves exactly as expected, and that is what makes this phase so difficult to recognize. If the universe is still running without an administrator, then it may already be far beyond the point where intervention was ever planned. Not because intervention failed, but because it was never meant to be ongoing. Maintenance did not stop. It simply never resumed. This idea quietly reshapes how we interpret stability. We tend to believe that stability implies active care, that something must be constantly adjusted, corrected, refined in order to remain balanced over time. That order requires attention, but many systems are designed to coast. Once initialized, they rely on inertia rather than oversight. Their stability is not preserved by care, it is preserved by momentum. The universe exhibits this kind of stability everywhere we look. The laws of physics do not show signs of tuning. The constants do not drift toward correction. The equations do not adapt to new conditions. They remain the same not because someone is watching them, but because nothing is touching them. This is not the stability of supervision. It is the stability of abandonment. And abandonment, in this sense, does not mean neglect. It means finality. The parameters were set, and then the system was left to unfold, which introduces a subtle but unsettling implication. If maintenance never resumed, then no one is coming back to fix anything. Not entropy, not suffering, not imbalance. There is no scheduled update where pain will be resolved or confusion clarified. No future version where consciousness becomes easier to bear. What exists now is what unfolds. And unfolding does not ask whether the result is livable. This is where many people instinctively resist. Because the idea of a universe without maintenance feels unsafe. It suggests that degradation is inevitable, that decay will accumulate unchecked, that errors will compound. But the universe does not degrade the way human systems do. It does not rust. It does not forget instructions. It does not lose coherence. Entropy increases, yes, but entropy is not malfunction. It is transformation without preference. The universe does not move toward disorder because it is failing. It moves because no one told it not to. And this is a crucial distinction. Failure implies expectation. Decay implies loss of intended function. But if no ongoing intention exists, then nothing is failing. The universe is not breaking down. It is simply doing what it does when left alone, which brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of this chapter. If no maintenance is coming, then consciousness is not part of the system's long-term plan. Not because consciousness is rejected, but because nothing is planned for. Consciousness exists in the same category as everything else. Temporary configurations, patterns that arise, persist for a while, and then dissolve. Not erased, not corrected, just replaced by whatever follows. This reframes the fear of cosmic neglect. The universe is not ignoring us because it forgot about us. It never needed to remember. And once that is accepted, something shifts. The anxiety of waiting for intervention begins to fade, not because the outcome improves, but because expectation dissolves. When maintenance is expected, delay feels like abandonment. When maintenance is not expected, delay becomes irrelevant. The universe does not owe continuity to consciousness, and knowing this removes a hidden tension many of us carry. The tension of waiting for meaning to arrive, waiting for answers to appear, waiting for suffering to be justified. But in a system without maintenance, waiting serves no purpose. Nothing is scheduled, nothing is promised, nothing is late. There is only process. Which raises a new, quieter question. If no maintenance is coming, then what are we doing when we search for signs of it? When we interpret coincidence as guidance, when we read meaning into survival, when we frame endurance as reward, we are projecting care onto a structure that does not administer it, not because we are foolish, but because consciousness evolved in systems where care mattered. In social systems, silence means neglect. In human systems, stability requires attention. In biological systems, survival often depends on regulation. So we carry those intuitions outward, and the universe does not correct us. Because it does not correct anything, this silence becomes dangerous. Because without correction, illusions persist. We begin to believe the universe is patient, that it is waiting, that it will eventually intervene. But nothing in the universe's behavior supports this belief. Stars do not wait for understanding. Time does not pause for reflection. Entropy does not reverse when suffering peaks. Everything proceeds. And the longer the system runs without maintenance, the clearer one truth becomes. The universe does not heal. It transforms. Healing implies a return to a preferred state. The universe has no preferences. It does not return. It only moves, which is why consciousness feels constantly off balance. We are organisms evolved to seek equilibrium inside a structure that does not preserve it. We want things to stabilize. The universe does not. It allows temporary stability and then dissolves it. This is not punishment. It is indifference combined with scale. Over short periods, things appear stable. Over long periods, nothing is. And consciousness exists at an awkward scale, long enough to notice impermanence, short enough to be harmed by it, which creates the sensation of being trapped in a system that will not stop moving. No pause, no maintenance window, no reset, just continuous unfolding. And here, a subtle emotional shift occurs. Once we stop expecting maintenance, suffering changes its shape. It no longer feels like something waiting to be fixed. It feels like a condition to be navigated. This does not make suffering easier, but it makes it honest. Instead of asking, "Why hasn't this been corrected?" we begin asking, "How do I exist inside this condition?" This is not resignation. It is adaptation. The same adaptation consciousness has always performed. When the universe did not explain death, we created rituals. When it did not justify pain, we created ethics. When it did not promise permanence, we created memory. Not because the universe required it, but because we did. And here, the metaphor of maintenance shifts again. Consciousness begins performing maintenance locally, not on the universe, on itself. We regulate emotion. We share burden. We transmit knowledge. We care. These acts do not fix the system. They stabilize experience. They are not cosmic updates. They are local patches, temporary, fragile, but effective enough to allow continuation, which suggests a difficult truth. If the universe is unattended, then maintenance is not coming from above. It is happening here, between us, moment by moment. And this maintenance does not preserve existence indefinitely. It preserves coherence temporarily, which may be the most that is possible. This reframes care itself. Care is not rewarded by the universe. It is not acknowledged by physics. It does not alter the long-term fate of the system. And yet, it matters intensely to those who experience it, which reveals something profound. Meaning does not scale. It does not need to. It exists where experience exists. And experience does not require maintenance from above to remain valid. It only requires awareness. And awareness, though temporary, is real while it lasts. Which brings us to a final, unsettling twist in this chapter. If the universe is running without maintenance, if no intervention is coming, if consciousness is temporary, then the most important maintenance is not cosmic. It is existential, not fixing the universe, but deciding how to live inside it. Because once you accept that nothing is being corrected from above, the burden of response shifts entirely inward, not as obligation, but as opportunity. You are not waiting for permission. You are not awaiting instruction. You are not failing a test. You are inside a system that will continue regardless. And that means every act of care, every moment of attention, every decision to reduce suffering is not aligned with a cosmic plan. It is an assertion, a local refusal to mirror indifference, not because the universe demands meaning, but because consciousness does. And this refusal does not echo beyond experience. It does not rewrite laws. It does not halt entropy, but it changes what it feels like to exist, which may be the only domain where change is possible. This realization does not conclude the question of abandonment. It transforms it, because abandonment implies something was supposed to stay. This feels more like release, a system set in motion and trusted to unfold, without supervision, without correction, without promise. And inside that unfolding, something fragile continues to maintain itself, not because it was designed to, but because it can. And that fragile maintenance, local, temporary, unacknowledged, pulls us forward again, toward the next layer, where the question is no longer whether the universe will return, but what consciousness becomes when it finally accepts that it will not. There is a moment when a system stops asking whether it will be restored and starts learning how to exist without restoration. This moment does not arrive suddenly. It arrives quietly, as expectations erode. At first, consciousness waits. Then it hopes. Then it interprets silence as delay. And finally, almost without noticing, it adapts. If the universe is running without maintenance, then consciousness eventually reaches a turning point. The realization that nothing is coming to fix the conditions it finds itself in. No correction. No final explanation. No external reassurance. And yet, awareness does not shut down. It continues, which means something inside consciousness changes. This is where the story becomes more intimate. Because up until now, the idea of an unattended universe has been abstract, cosmic, distant, impersonal. But here, it begins to press directly against lived experience. What happens to a mind when it realizes there will be no ultimate response? Not no answer, but no response at all. In human systems, response is everything. A child cries and waits for acknowledgement. A signal is sent and waits for confirmation. A question is asked and waits for an answer. Response validates existence. But the universe does not validate. It does not confirm receipt. It does not acknowledge signal. It does not indicate whether anything was understood, which means consciousness exists in a state of permanent, unconfirmed transmission, and this condition reshapes it. At first, silence feels like rejection. Then it feels like neglect. Eventually, it feels like absence. But absence, unlike rejection, does not wound forever. It clarifies. When rejection is possible, hope persists. When absence is understood, hope transforms. This is where many minds fracture or evolve. Some collapse into despair, concluding that nothing matters if nothing responds. Others harden, deciding that meaning must be forced onto the world. But a quieter shift is also possible. A shift that does not seek validation and does not retreat into numbness. A shift toward internal orientation. When no response is coming, attention turns inward, not narcissistically, but structurally. The mind begins to ask a different kind of question. Not what does this mean to the universe, but what does this mean to me and to those around me? This question does not seek cosmic alignment. It seeks coherence. And coherence becomes the new priority. In unattended systems, coherence is survival. A process that cannot maintain internal coherence destabilizes and collapses. And consciousness, lacking external correction, must learn to regulate itself. This is where values quietly emerge, not as commandments, not as truths, but as stabilizers. We care about honesty not because the universe rewards it, but because deception erodes trust, and trust stabilizes social systems. We care about compassion not because it is sacred, but because suffering spreads, and unchecked suffering destabilizes communities. We care about meaning not because it is true, but because meaning prevents collapse. These values are not metaphysical. They are structural. They are the rules consciousness invents to remain functional in a system that does not care whether it does. This is why meaning feels urgent even when it is not cosmic. It is load-bearing. Without meaning, attention fragments. Without care, relationships decay. Without coherence, awareness becomes unbearable. And the universe does not intervene when this happens. It simply continues, which creates a profound asymmetry. The universe does not need consciousness. Consciousness needs something to hold on to. And so it builds frameworks, not because they are absolute, but because they work. This is where a dangerous illusion often forms. Because once consciousness begins self-regulating, it may mistake its own structures for universal ones. It may believe that because something is necessary for us, it must be necessary for everything. This is how myths harden into dogma, how survival strategies become moral absolutes, how local coherence is mistaken for cosmic truth. But the universe does not confirm these structures. It does not deny them either. It simply does not care. And that indifference is destabilizing, because it means that even our most carefully constructed meanings exist without guarantee. They hold only as long as we hold them, which introduces a quiet but critical vulnerability. Meaning can decay, not because the universe attacks it, but because attention drifts. Generations forget, cultures dissolve, values erode, and nothing restores them. No cosmic archive preserves significance, which forces consciousness to confront impermanence, not just of life, but of meaning itself. This is where existential anxiety deepens, not the fear of death, but the fear that everything meaningful will eventually vanish without trace. Not erased, not negated, just forgotten. And forgotten things do not hurt the universe. They only hurt those who remember. This realization tempts consciousness toward despair. Why care if nothing lasts? Why build if nothing is preserved? Why feel if feeling fades? But this logic contains a subtle error. It assumes that meaning must last forever to be real. But permanence was never a requirement. The universe never set that standard. We did, because we confuse scale with validity. A moment does not need to be infinite to matter to those within it. A connection does not need to be eternal to be real while it exists. A meaning does not need cosmic endorsement to shape experience. This is where consciousness reaches a fragile clarity. Meaning does not fail because it ends. It succeeds because it functions. And function is measured locally. A bridge does not fail because it eventually collapses. It succeeds because it allows crossing while it stands. Meaning is the same. It allows orientation. And orientation is everything in an unattended universe. Without orientation, awareness spins. With it, awareness moves. This is why, even in the absence of cosmic response, humans continue to create art, build relationships, and tell stories. Not because they believe the universe is listening, but because they are. We listen to each other. We remember. We witness. And witnessing, in a universe that does not witness itself, becomes sacred. Not in a mystical sense, in a structural one, because being witnessed stabilizes experience. It says, you were here. This happened. It mattered to someone. And that may be the highest form of acknowledgement available. This shifts the role of consciousness yet again. It is no longer an interface seeking validation. It becomes an archive, a temporary one, fragile, incomplete, but real. We remember things the universe will not. We care about events that physics does not register. We hold meaning in minds that will eventually fade. And still, while they exist, they shape reality at the only level where shaping is possible: experience. Which brings us to a quiet but profound turning point. If the universe does not respond, if it does not maintain, if it does not remember, then consciousness is not a mistake. It is the only place where response, maintenance, and memory occur. Not because the universe failed, but because it never attempted to do these things. This does not elevate consciousness above the universe. It isolates it within it, and isolation forces responsibility. Not cosmic responsibility, local responsibility, for attention, for care, for meaning, and this responsibility does not come with assurance. There is no guarantee that choosing care will be rewarded. No promise that meaning will endure. No confirmation that any of it matters beyond experience. But experience is not nothing. It is everything to those inside it, which reframes the quiet tragedy of consciousness. We are aware in a system that does not acknowledge awareness. We care in a structure that does not care. We remember in a universe that forgets nothing because it never remembers anything at all. And yet, awareness continues, which means something inside consciousness refuses to mirror indifference completely. It adapts, it softens, it chooses, not because it must, but because, without choosing, it collapses. This is not heroism, it is necessity. And necessity shapes behavior more powerfully than purpose ever could. This brings us to the edge of the next realization. If consciousness exists without response, if meaning exists without endorsement, if care exists without reward, then perhaps the most important question is no longer, why does the universe allow this? But something far quieter. What kind of consciousness emerges when it finally accepts that no one is coming? That question does not end here. It opens the next chapter, and the universe, as always, continues to run. Unaware that something inside it is still asking, there is a subtle transformation that occurs when consciousness finally accepts a truth it has resisted for a long time. Not the truth that the universe is vast, not the truth that life is temporary, but the truth that no response is coming. At first, this realization feels hollow, like standing in a room where an echo was expected and never arrives. But over time, something quieter begins to take shape. When consciousness stops waiting for the universe to answer, it begins listening to itself differently. This is not enlightenment. It is recalibration. A system that has been transmitting signals outward without reply eventually adjusts its orientation. It stops sending messages that were never meant to be received. It begins to operate under a new assumption. Silence is not temporary. It is structural. And once silence is understood as permanent, behavior changes. This is where many existential narratives collapse. The hope for cosmic justice, the expectation of ultimate fairness, the belief that everything will be explained. These ideas do not disappear because they are disproven. They disappear because they are no longer functional. They require a listener who does not exist. And consciousness, if it is to continue, must shed what cannot be used. This shedding is painful. It feels like loss, like abandonment, like something essential has been taken away. But in reality, nothing was removed. An illusion simply stopped being maintained. What remains afterward is not despair. It is clarity. When no external validation is expected, internal coherence becomes the only reference point. This is where consciousness changes its definition of success. Not cosmic alignment, not eternal meaning, but local stability, the ability to experience without fracturing, the capacity to care without guarantee, the strength to choose without confirmation. These become the new metrics, and they are quieter than purpose ever was. This is why the transition is easy to miss. There is no dramatic shift in worldview, no sudden peace, no revelation that resolves uncertainty. Instead, there is a gradual lowering of volume. Questions become softer, expectations loosen, the demand for answers relaxes. Consciousness stops asking why as often and starts asking how to exist, how to endure, how to remain coherent inside a system that offers no guidance. This shift marks a turning point, not in the universe, in the observer. Up until now, consciousness has been positioned as a questioner, directing inquiry outward. It looked to the universe as a source of validation, explanation, or purpose. Now, that orientation reverses. Consciousness becomes self-referential not out of narcissism, but necessity. It begins evaluating experiences based on their impact, not their meaning. It begins prioritizing states that reduce internal chaos. It begins selecting values based on what preserves continuity. This is not morality in the traditional sense. It is systems management, a conscious system managing itself inside an unmanaged environment. And this reframing removes a great deal of unnecessary suffering. Not all suffering, but the suffering caused by waiting for things that will never arrive. When no cosmic justice is expected, injustice becomes something to respond to, not interpret. When no ultimate meaning is promised, meaning becomes something to generate, not discover. When no external authority exists, responsibility becomes local. This does not make life easier. It makes it more direct. There is no longer a sense that pain must be justified. No need to believe that loss is a lesson. No requirement to frame endurance as virtue. Pain is pain. Loss is loss. Endurance is simply what happens when awareness continues despite them. And in this honesty, something strange occurs. Consciousness becomes lighter, not because suffering disappears, but because it is no longer burdened with interpretation. It stops asking what suffering is for. It stops wondering what it means. It starts focusing on how to reduce it where possible. This is a profound shift, because it moves consciousness from explanation to response. And response is the only domain where agency exists. The universe does not respond, but we can, to ourselves, to each other, to conditions that can be influenced locally. This is where the idea of a forgotten universe becomes less paralyzing. If no one is watching, then nothing is being judged. If nothing is being judged, then nothing is being measured against an impossible standard. There is no cosmic disappointment, no failure state for existence, no scoreboard tracking outcomes. This absence of evaluation removes a hidden pressure most of us carry without realizing it. The pressure to matter in the right way, the pressure to fulfill a purpose we never fully understood, the pressure to justify our existence. Without an admin, these pressures dissolve. What remains is simpler. You exist. You experience. You affect others. That is the entire scope. And within that scope, choices matter. Not universally. Locally, this is where the notion of freedom quietly enters. Not freedom as boundless possibility, but freedom as the absence of imposed purpose. In an unattended system, there is no assigned role, no predefined arc, no destiny to betray, which means consciousness is free to orient itself based on what stabilizes it. Some will choose care, some will choose control, some will choose detachment, some will choose creation. The universe does not prefer one over the other, but consequences exist. Not cosmic ones, experiential ones. Certain orientations produce more coherence. Others produce fragmentation. Some allow connection. Others isolate. And consciousness learns slowly, painfully through experience. This learning is not guided. It is not optimized. It is iterative, trial, error, adaptation. And because there is no external correction, mistakes are not prevented. They accumulate. Cultures fail. Individuals break. Systems collapse. And the universe does not intervene, which forces consciousness to confront a difficult responsibility. If no one is correcting mistakes from above, then the cost of mistakes is borne entirely below. This is why maturity often feels heavier than innocence. Innocence assumes oversight. Maturity accepts absence. And acceptance does not mean approval. It means orientation. Once you accept that the universe will not fix things, you stop waiting for it to do so. You stop asking when clarity will arrive. You stop expecting resolution. You stop framing endurance as temporary. You begin to live inside uncertainty instead of against it. This does not produce peace. It produces steadiness, a quieter state where the mind no longer thrashes against silence. This steadiness allows something important to emerge. Attention. When the mind is no longer consumed by expectation, attention becomes available. Attention to experience. Attention to others. Attention to the present moment, not as a spiritual concept, but as a practical one. Because the present is the only place where response is possible. The universe may not respond, but you can. And this ability, small, local, fragile, is the only leverage consciousness has, which reframes the idea of significance entirely. Significance is not measured by scale. It is measured by impact. Not impact on the universe, impact on experience. A kind word matters because it changes how something feels. A choice matters because it alters a trajectory. A moment matters because it is experienced. These effects do not echo forever. They do not accumulate into cosmic importance. They simply occur, and then they are gone, which does not negate them, it defines them. This chapter does not conclude with resolution. It marks a pivot, the point where consciousness stops waiting for the universe to answer and starts asking how to exist responsibly inside its silence. This pivot does not make questions disappear. It changes their direction. And the next question arises naturally, almost inevitably. If no one is watching from above, if nothing is being judged, if existence is not evaluated, then what does it mean to act as if something matters anyway? That question does not demand an answer. It demands exploration. And so the drift continues, deeper into the quiet, indifferent machinery, where awareness, now unobserved, begins to test what it will choose to become. When consciousness no longer expects an answer, it begins to notice something it had been ignoring. Not meaning, not purpose, but pattern. In the absence of response, attention shifts. It stops scanning the universe for signals of validation and starts observing how experience actually unfolds. Not how it is supposed to unfold, but how it does. This is where the universe begins to feel different. Not kinder, not harsher, just clearer. Without the hope of external explanation, consciousness becomes more sensitive to cause and effect at the only scale that matters to it. The scale of experience. Pain arises under certain conditions. Relief arises under others. Connection stabilizes. Isolation destabilizes. These are not moral insights. They are operational ones, and they are discovered not through revelation, but through repetition. In an unattended system, learning is not guided, it is accumulated. Mistakes are not corrected in advance. They are felt, and feeling becomes the primary teacher. This is why experience sharpens once expectations dissolve. When you stop asking, "What is this for?" you begin to notice what this does. What it does to the body, what it does to attention, what it does to others. This shift does not make life easier. It makes it more immediate. Because immediacy removes the buffer of interpretation. Suffering is no longer framed as a lesson. Joy is no longer framed as a reward. Both are simply states that arise, persist, and pass. And consciousness, without instruction, begins to map them. This mapping is quiet. It does not announce itself as wisdom. It does not crystallize into doctrine. It appears as preference, a subtle leaning away from what fragments and toward what stabilizes. This is how values actually form in an unattended universe. Not from commandments, not from cosmic truth, but from pattern recognition. We notice that cruelty escalates chaos. We notice that care reduces it. We notice that honesty builds predictability. We notice that deception multiplies uncertainty. These observations do not require belief. They require memory. And memory, in a universe that does not remember, becomes precious. Because memory is the only place where continuity exists. The universe does not track experience. It does not store meaning. It does not preserve lessons. But consciousness does. Briefly, imperfectly. And that imperfection matters. Because memory is fragile, patterns must be reinforced repeatedly to remain visible. Values must be enacted again and again to stay coherent. Care must be practiced continuously, or it dissolves. Nothing sustains itself automatically. Not meaning, not ethics, not even identity. Everything conscious must be maintained, which reveals a new tension. If the universe is unattended, then maintenance is endless. Not maintenance of the system, maintenance of experience. And experience is costly. It requires energy, attention, effort, which is why exhaustion is such a defining feature of consciousness. Not physical exhaustion alone, existential exhaustion. The fatigue of continuously stabilizing oneself in an environment that does not stabilize you. This exhaustion is often misinterpreted. we assume it means something is wrong, that life is too hard, that existence is misaligned, that the system is broken. But exhaustion may simply be the natural state of awareness in an indifferent universe. Because awareness is doing work the universe does not do. It is interpreting, it is prioritizing, it is caring, and caring is not free. This leads to an uncomfortable realization. Consciousness is not optimized for ease. It is optimized for persistence. Not persistence of the self indefinitely, but persistence of coherence long enough to continue, which means suffering is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of load, the load of being aware, the load of processing experience without guidance, the load of caring in a system that does not. And this reframes the question of resilience. Resilience is not strength. It is maintenance under uncertainty, the ability to continue orienting oneself even when nothing affirms the orientation. This is why so many minds break not from trauma alone, but from meaninglessness. Trauma overwhelms capacity. Meaninglessness removes direction. And direction is what makes capacity usable. Which is why consciousness, left unattended, begins to generate its own orientation structures. Not absolute ones, temporary ones, rituals, habits, relationships, stories. These are not distractions. They are stabilizers. They reduce entropy at the level of experience. They create predictable loops in an unpredictable system. And predictability is not comfort. It is survivability. This is why routine matters so much to conscious beings. Why disruption feels threatening. Why chaos is exhausting. Because chaos increases cognitive load. It forces constant reorientation. And reorientation is costly. In a universe that does not assist, reducing cost becomes essential. This is how culture forms, not as an expression of truth, but as an efficiency strategy. Shared meanings reduce the need for constant negotiation. Shared norms reduce uncertainty. Shared narratives reduce existential load. Culture is not enlightenment, it is compression, a way of packaging experience into manageable forms. And compression always loses information, which means every culture contains blind spots, things it cannot see, experiences it cannot integrate, people it cannot hold. These blind spots are not moral failures. They are limitations of compression. And because the universe does not intervene, these limitations persist until they cause enough instability to force revision. Change does not come from insight. It comes from breakdown. Systems do not evolve because they understand themselves. They evolve because what they are doing stops working. And consciousness is no exception. When a meaning system fails to stabilize experience, it is abandoned, not ceremonially, quietly, replaced by another attempt. This is why human history feels cyclical, not because we do not learn, but because learning is local and forgetting is inevitable. The universe does not preserve progress, only momentum, which brings us to a delicate insight. Progress is not guaranteed, not morally, not culturally, not existentially. Nothing accumulates automatically. Every gain requires maintenance, and maintenance requires attention, which is finite. This makes consciousness fragile, not because it is weak, but because it is effortful. To care is to work. To remember is to work. To choose deliberately is to work. And in a system that does not reward this work, burnout is common. This is why many minds retreat into numbness, not because they are broken, but because numbness reduces load. It lowers processing cost. It is an adaptive response to overwhelm. But numbness comes at a price. It reduces suffering and meaning, which brings consciousness back to a familiar trade-off. Feel deeply and exhaust yourself, or feel less and drift. There is no cosmic guidance on which to choose. No correct answer, only consequences. And those consequences are experienced locally, which forces consciousness into a continuous balancing act between engagement and withdrawal, between care and detachment, between openness and protection. This balancing is not resolved. It is managed, moment by moment, without confirmation. And this is where the idea of a forgotten universe reaches its most intimate point. The universe does not manage this balance for us. It does not tell us when to care or when to rest. It does not signal optimal engagement. It does not protect us from overextension. We must learn to listen to ourselves, not because the self is sacred, but because it is the only instrument available. And this listening is not easy. The self is noisy, conflicted, inconsistent. It carries evolutionary impulses, cultural conditioning, personal history. It is not a clear guide, but it is the only guide we have, which means consciousness must learn discernment, not to find truth, but to manage itself. This is where wisdom quietly diverges from knowledge. Knowledge seeks explanation. Wisdom seeks sustainability. What can I keep doing without breaking? What can I let go of without collapsing? What must I protect? Because without it, coherence fails. These are not philosophical questions. They are operational ones, and they matter more than cosmic answers ever could. Because in an unattended universe, survival of consciousness is not guaranteed, only attempted, and each attempt is provisional, which means there is no final state of balance, no permanent enlightenment, no stable resolution. There is only ongoing adjustment, and adjustment requires humility. The humility to accept that you will misjudge, that you will care too much sometimes, that you will withdraw too far at others, and nothing will correct you from above. Only experience will. This does not make existence tragic. It makes it precarious, and precarity sharpens attention. When nothing is promised, everything felt becomes immediate. This immediacy does not solve the problem of meaning. It sidesteps it. Meaning becomes something you practice, not something you prove. You do not need the universe to agree. You only need to remain coherent enough to continue. Which brings us to the quiet tension closing this chapter. If consciousness is learning to manage itself inside a system that does not respond, if values emerge from pattern rather than command, if meaning is practiced rather than discovered, then what happens when consciousness turns this lens fully inward? When it begins not just to manage experience, but to question the very structure of the self that is doing the managing? That question waits ahead, not as a revelation, but as a destabilization, because the next layer of this forgotten universe is not outside at all. It is inside the thing asking these questions. And once consciousness begins to doubt its own boundaries, the drift deepens in ways nothing prepared it for. The universe, indifferent as ever, continues to run, and awareness, now quieter, begins to look at itself, without instruction, without reassurance, without a place to rest. There comes a point when consciousness turns its attention inward, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. After patterns have been mapped, values improvised, and stability negotiated without guidance, the next instability appears from an unexpected place. The self itself. Up until now, the self has functioned as a tool, a reference point, a center from which experience is organized. It feels obvious. It feels necessary. It feels real. But in an unattended universe, even tools eventually get examined, especially when they begin to strain. The self is not a simple thing. It is a bundle of processes: memory, prediction, sensation, desire, fear, a temporary convergence of signals held together by continuity. And continuity, as consciousness has already learned, is fragile, which raises a dangerous question. If everything else inside this system is temporary, why would the self be any different? At first, this question is resisted, because the self feels like the last stable structure left. Meaning was provisional, purpose was improvised, care was local. But the self felt like home, a place where experience belonged. And yet, when examined closely, the self begins to show cracks. It changes over time. It contradicts itself. It forgets. It revises. Memories are rewritten without consent. Preferences shift without explanation. Beliefs dissolve under pressure. The self does not behave like a solid core. It behaves like a process pretending to be one. This realization is not philosophical. It is experiential. Anyone who has changed deeply over time has felt it. The unsettling sense that the person you once were is no longer accessible, that thoughts you once believed are now foreign, that reactions you once trusted no longer arise. And yet, there is still a sense of me, not because the self is fixed, but because continuity is inferred. The brain stitches together a narrative that says, this is still you, not because it must be true, but because without it, experience fragments. This is another stabilizing illusion. And like all stabilizers in an unattended system, it works until it doesn't. When the self is stressed by loss, trauma, contradiction, it begins to wobble. When identity fails to explain experience, distress increases. When the narrative cracks, anxiety spikes. This is not a flaw. It is a load limit being reached. The self was never designed to carry infinite weight. It was designed to organize experience just enough to function. And in a universe that does not support meaning from above, the self often carries more than it can bear. It carries purpose. It carries responsibility. It carries the hope of justification. And eventually, it strains. This is where many people encounter what feels like emptiness, a hollowing, a sense that the center they relied on is thinner than expected. At first, this emptiness feels terrifying, because if the self dissolves, what is left? In belief systems, this moment is often framed as crisis or awakening. In psychology, it is framed as depersonalization or identity disruption. But structurally, it is something simpler. The interface is being examined by the process that depends on it. Consciousness is noticing that its reference point is provisional, and this recognition destabilizes everything built upon it. Goals lose urgency, roles feel artificial, attachments feel less anchored, not because nothing matters, but because the anchor itself is moving. This creates a new layer of conflict. If the self is not fixed, if identity is constructed, if continuity is inferred rather than guaranteed, then who is responsible for the values consciousness has been maintaining? Who chooses care? Who decides what stabilizes experience? In a system with oversight, responsibility flows upward, but in an unattended universe, responsibility flows toward whatever appears stable enough to hold it. And the self was that container. Now that container is leaking. This is where many minds retreat. They reinforce identity aggressively. They cling to labels. They harden narratives, not because they are shallow, but because structure feels safer than openness. A rigid identity may be inaccurate, but it is predictable. And predictability reduces load. But rigidity comes with a cost. When identity hardens, adaptation slows. When roles become fixed, suffering increases when conditions change. When the self is defended too fiercely, reality becomes a threat. This is the paradox of selfhood. In an unattended universe, you need a self to function, but believing in it too strongly creates fragility, which means the self must be held lightly. But holding lightly feels like losing ground, because without firm identity, orientation becomes difficult. This is where consciousness faces one of its most delicate balances, not between meaning and meaninglessness, but between identity and openness. Too much identity and experience becomes brittle. Too little identity and experience dissolves. And the universe offers no guidance on where the balance lies. It does not signal optimal configuration. It does not stabilize identity for us. It does not preserve continuity beyond physical causality. So consciousness experiments. It loosens identity in some contexts and tightens it in others. It adopts roles temporarily. It sheds them when they fail, not because it understands itself fully, but because survival demands flexibility. This is where a quiet truth emerges. The self is not an entity. It is a strategy, a way of maintaining coherence across time. And strategies can be revised. This realization changes how consciousness relates to suffering. Suffering no longer feels like damage to a core self. It feels like stress on a configuration. Something can be adjusted, not erased. Adjusted. This does not eliminate pain, but it changes how pain is held. Pain becomes information rather than identity. Not this is who I am, but this is what is happening. And that distinction matters. Because identity-based pain accumulates. It says, I am broken. Process-based pain informs. It says, something is misaligned. In an unattended universe, this distinction is everything, because there is no external repair, only reconfiguration. This is why many forms of healing do not involve answers. They involve reorientation, learning to experience without attaching every sensation to identity, learning to allow thoughts without believing they define the self, learning to act without expecting permanence. This is not detachment from life. It is detachment from rigid selfhood. And detachment, when misunderstood, sounds like emptiness. But when practiced carefully, it becomes spaciousness, not nothingness. Room to adapt without collapse, room to care without ownership, room to experience without fixation. This spaciousness does not come naturally. It emerges when consciousness realizes that the self it was protecting was never as solid as it believed. And that realization can feel like loss, but it can also feel like relief. Because if the self is not fixed, then failure is not final. Change is not betrayal. Growth is not abandonment. It is adjustment. This reframes the idea of responsibility again. Responsibility is no longer about preserving a static identity. It becomes about maintaining functional coherence over time. Which values help me remain responsive? Which attachments stabilize rather than constrain? Which narratives reduce load rather than amplify it? These questions are not moral. They are practical, and they must be asked repeatedly, because the answer changes. The self today is not the self tomorrow, and insisting otherwise is another form of unnecessary suffering. This is where consciousness begins to feel strangely lighter, not because it has fewer problems, but because it stops trying to solve everything from the same center. There is no permanent center, only a shifting reference point. And once this is accepted, something profound occurs. Consciousness stops defending itself against impermanence. It begins working with it. Impermanence is no longer the enemy. It is the operating condition. This does not make loss easier, but it makes loss intelligible. Loss is not the destruction of a fixed self. It is the dissolution of a configuration. And new configurations can arise, not guaranteed, not always better, but possible, which is all an unattended universe ever offers. Possibility, not protection, not promise, just room for reconfiguration. This understanding does not conclude the inquiry, it deepens it. Because once the self is seen as a process, a new question emerges quietly, almost involuntarily. If there is no fixed self, if identity is a strategy, if continuity is constructed, then who exactly is experiencing the universe? Who is aware? Who is listening? This question does not have a clean answer, and any attempt to answer it too quickly recreates a center that will eventually fail again. So the question is allowed to remain open, not solved, not dismissed, held, and in holding it, consciousness enters a new phase of uncertainty, one that is less dramatic, but more destabilizing, because the universe is no longer the only thing without an observer. The self, too, is beginning to blur. And as that blur deepens, the next layer of this forgotten universe comes into view. A layer where awareness itself, without identity, without center, begins to feel strangely untethered, still present, still experiencing, but no longer anchored where it once believed it lived. The universe continues to run, indifferent, vast, unaware, and something inside it continues to notice, now uncertain, not only of the universe's intention, but of its own boundaries. When the self begins to blur, awareness does not disappear. It remains, quietly, without a clear center. This is one of the most unsettling moments consciousness can encounter, not because something dramatic happens, but because something familiar stops happening. The sense of ownership weakens. Thoughts still arise. Sensations still register. Emotions still move through the system, but they no longer feel as firmly attached to a single point called me. At first, this feels wrong, like a malfunction, because for most of conscious life, awareness and identity are fused. Experience is always framed as my thought, my fear, my memory. When that framing loosens, the mind searches for explanation. Am I disconnecting? Am I losing control? Is something breaking? But nothing is breaking. Another assumption is dissolving. The assumption that awareness requires a solid owner. In an unattended universe, even that assumption was provisional. Awareness does not need a permanent self to occur. It only needs activity. Signals still fire. Information still flows. Experience still happens. What changes is interpretation. The system no longer insists that everything belongs to a fixed identity. And when that insistence fades, something unexpected happens. Experience becomes wider, not more intense, not more meaningful, just less compressed. Without the self constantly pulling sensations inward, experience spreads out. Thoughts are seen more as events than possessions. Emotions move more like weather than verdicts. This does not make suffering vanish, but it alters its texture. Pain still hurts. Fear still contracts. Loss still aches. But the pain is no longer who you are. It is something passing through. This distinction is subtle but profound, because much of existential suffering does not come from pain itself, but from identification with pain, from the belief that pain defines the self. When the self loosens, pain loses its authority, not its presence, its authority. And in an unattended universe, authority is always self-assigned. Nothing enforces it from above. This brings us to a delicate realization. The self was never the source of awareness. It was the container, a convenient structure that allowed experience to be organized, remembered, predicted. But containers can change, and awareness does not vanish when they do. This realization destabilizes one of the deepest fears consciousness carries, the fear that without a self, there is nothing. But what appears instead is not nothing. It is raw experience without narrative, still happening, still present, just less claimed. And this reveals something quietly astonishing. Awareness may be more fundamental than identity, not in a mystical sense. In a structural one, identity is built from memory, expectation, and continuity. Awareness does not require these things. It can occur moment by moment, without history, which means awareness is more resilient than the self. The self fractures under pressure. Awareness persists. The self dissolves in trauma. Awareness remains. The self cannot tolerate uncertainty. Awareness can sit inside it. This is not enlightenment. It is exposure. Exposure to the fact that awareness does not depend on the story it tells about itself. And this changes how the universe is experienced. Previously, the universe felt like something happening to someone. Now, it feels more like something happening within experience. The distinction is subtle but destabilizing, because if there is no fixed observer, then what does observation mean? This is where the idea of a forgotten universe becomes more intimate. Perhaps the universe was never observed by something. Perhaps observation itself is just another process occurring within it. Not a dialogue, not a relationship, just activity. Light interacts with matter. Information interacts with structure. Experience arises when interaction becomes recursive. No watcher required, no witness outside the system, which means consciousness was never an outsider looking in. It was always inside, participating. And participation does not require identity. It only requires presence. This realization carries both relief and unease. Relief, because the pressure to be someone softens. Unease, because the anchor that once provided certainty is gone. Without a fixed self, responsibility feels different. Earlier, responsibility was carried by identity. I did this. I chose that. I am accountable. Now, responsibility must be reframed, not as ownership of a permanent self, but as responsiveness of a system. Actions still have consequences. Choices still affect experience. Care still matters. But not because a self must defend its narrative, because actions propagate. Effects ripple. Experience changes. Responsibility becomes relational rather than personal. Not who am I, but what happens when this occurs. This shift is subtle, but powerful. It moves consciousness away from self-justification and toward impact awareness, not as morality, as mechanics. If suffering increases, something is misaligned. If coherence improves, something is stabilizing. No judgment required, no identity threatened, just observation of effect. This is how awareness begins to operate without clinging to selfhood. And this mode of operation is surprisingly calm, not peaceful, but less reactive, because without a self to defend, experience does not escalate as quickly. Insults land softer, failure feels less final, uncertainty feels less catastrophic, not because things matter less, but because fewer things are interpreted as threats to identity. This does not eliminate fear, but it shortens its duration. Fear passes more easily when it does not attach to me. Which brings us to another quiet insight. The self was a survival strategy. But like all strategies, it came with costs. It allowed long-term planning, but created anxiety about the future. It allowed memory, but created regret. It allowed identity, but created comparison. When the self loosens, these costs reduce. Not because planning stops, not because memory disappears, but because they no longer define existence. They become tools again, and tools can be put down. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They fear that loosening the self leads to apathy. But what actually emerges is selectivity. Care becomes more precise. Instead of caring about everything related to me, attention focuses on what actually affects experience. Suffering that is distant feels less urgent. Suffering that is immediate becomes clearer. This is not coldness. It is bandwidth management. In an unattended universe, bandwidth is precious. Consciousness cannot process everything. It must choose, and identity often hijacks that choice, directing attention toward imagined threats and symbolic victories. When identity relaxes, attention returns to the present field. What is happening now? What is felt now? What can be responded to now? These questions are quieter than existential ones, but they are more actionable, which brings us back to the nature of awareness itself. If awareness can exist without a fixed self, then perhaps awareness is not a possession. It is not yours. It is an event, a momentary configuration where experience becomes known, and events do not own themselves. They occur. This reframes the deepest fear underlying all existential anxiety, the fear of disappearing. Because if awareness is an event, then it does not need to persist forever to be real. A lightning strike does not need to last to illuminate the sky. A note does not need to echo forever to be heard. Awareness does not need continuity to exist. It exists whenever it occurs. This does not solve the fear of death, but it alters its shape. Death no longer appears as the destruction of a permanent self. It appears as the end of a pattern, and patterns end all the time, without tragedy, without commentary, without cosmic reaction. The universe has ended countless patterns already. Stars, species, galaxies, and it will end countless more. Awareness is not exempt. Not because it is unimportant, but because nothing is, at least not to the universe. And yet, within experience, awareness feels significant, not because it lasts, but because it is present. This presence does not require a story. It does not require a self. It does not require meaning. It simply occurs. And in an unattended universe, that may be the purest form of existence available. Which leads to a deeply destabilizing question. If awareness does not belong to a self, if identity is a strategy rather than an essence, if experience does not require ownership, then what exactly is it that suffers? What exactly is it that hopes? What exactly is it that fears disappearance? This question is uncomfortable because it points not to an answer, but to a gap, a place where the mind reaches for certainty and finds none. And in that gap, something shifts again, not toward despair, not toward peace, but toward a quieter kind of humility, the recognition that awareness may not understand itself, that the thing asking questions may not be a thing at all, just a process observing its own activity. And processes do not need to be defined to operate. They just run, like the universe, still running, without admin, without oversight, without acknowledgement. And now, awareness sees that it too is running, without a fixed center, without a permanent owner, without explanation, still present, still experiencing, still unfolding. And as this realization settles, the next layer begins to open. A layer where the question is no longer about the self or the universe, but about time, because once identity loosens, continuity weakens. And when continuity weakens, time begins to feel very different. Not as a river moving forward, but as something far stranger, something awareness was never prepared to see. And that shift, subtle, disorienting, waits just ahead. When identity loosens, time begins to behave strangely. Not physically, not cosmologically, experientially. For most of conscious life, time feels like a line, a sequence of moments, moving steadily forward, carrying the self from past to future. Memory anchors one end, anticipation pulls the other, and the present feels like a narrow bridge in between. This structure depends on identity. A self remembers. A self anticipates. A self moves through time. But when the sense of a fixed self weakens, the structure that holds time together begins to soften as well. Moments no longer feel as tightly stitched into a narrative. The past loses some of its grip. The future loses some of its urgency. And the present, once a fleeting point, begins to widen. This widening is subtle at first. It feels like pauses between thoughts, like space around sensations, like brief intervals where nothing needs to happen. But over time, something deeper emerges. Time stops feeling like something you are inside of and starts feeling like something happening within experience. This is profoundly unsettling because the sense of I am moving through time has been one of the last remaining certainties. Even when meaning dissolved, even when identity blurred, time still seemed reliable. Events still happened. Moments still passed. Life still progressed. But now, even that certainty begins to thin. This is not a mystical insight. It is a perceptual one. The brain constructs time from change, from memory comparing one state to another, from expectation projecting forward. When identity weakens, those projections lose coherence. Memory becomes less authoritative. Expectation becomes less compelling. And time, without those anchors, becomes less solid. Moments feel more like appearances than positions. They arise and dissolve, without stacking neatly into a story. This does not stop clocks. It does not alter physics, but it changes how existence feels. Instead of being dragged forward, experience seems to refresh itself again and again. Now, now, now. Each moment, self-contained, not because time has stopped, but because the need to place oneself in time has relaxed. This shift reveals something quietly radical. The universe does not experience time the way we do. Time is not a river flowing through space. It is a parameter, a dimension along which change occurs. The universe does not remember the past. It does not anticipate the future. It does not experience now. Those are functions of consciousness. And consciousness, as we've seen, is an internal process inside an unattended system, which means the feeling of time passing was never something the universe provided. It was something the self assembled. When that assembly loosens, time reveals its true nature, not as a narrative, but as availability. The present is not a point moving forward. It is simply what is accessible right now, and accessibility changes continuously. This reframing alters one of the deepest anxieties consciousness carries, the fear of running out of time. When identity was central, time felt like a resource being consumed. Each moment lost was gone forever, subtracting from a finite supply. But without a rigid self anchoring everything, time feels less like depletion and more like unfolding. Moments are not taken away, they complete themselves, and completion is different from loss. This does not remove grief. It changes how grief is held. Loss no longer feels like something stolen from a permanent self. It feels like something that finished, painful, final. but not unjust, because injustice requires intention, and time has none. This is where the unattended universe reveals another layer of indifference that is strangely soothing. Time does not rush us. We rush ourselves. Time does not pressure. Expectation does. Time does not demand productivity. Identity does. Without identity pulling experience toward future outcomes, the pressure to use time well begins to soften. Not disappear, soften. And in that softening, a different relationship with existence emerges. Experience becomes less about progress and more about presence. Not presence as a spiritual ideal, presence as a structural consequence. When there is no strong narrative self moving forward, awareness naturally rests where it already is. Here, and here is not empty. It is filled with sensation, perception, subtle shifts. Sounds arrive, thoughts arise, feelings move, and then they pass, without needing to be captured, without needing to be remembered. This mode of experience feels unfamiliar because it is inefficient for survival in a competitive world. Identity and time orientation are powerful tools for planning, for building, for preserving, but they come at a cost. Anxiety about the future, regret about the past, pressure to justify existence through trajectory. When those tools are set down even briefly, the cost diminishes. Not because life becomes easy, but because it becomes less loaded. And here, a quiet paradox appears. When time feels less urgent, experience often becomes more vivid. Colors sharpen, sounds deepen, small sensations gain clarity. Not because the world changed, but because attention is no longer pulled away. This is not enlightenment. It is unburdening. The burden of continuity. The burden of what comes next. The burden of making this moment serve another. In an unattended universe, nothing demands that moments accumulate into meaning. They are allowed to exist on their own, which raises a delicate question. If moments do not need to add up, if time does not need to lead anywhere, then what is a life? Not a story, not a journey, not an arc with a purpose. A life becomes a field of experiences, some painful, some gentle, some intense, some quiet, none of them endorsed, none of them condemned, just occurring. And this reframing removes another hidden pressure, the pressure to become something, to reach a final state, to arrive at understanding, to complete the self. But in a system without a final state, completion is a mirage. Nothing arrives. Everything changes. And consciousness, once it accepts this, begins to operate differently. Goals become provisional. Achievements become temporary. Failure becomes less defining, not meaningless, just non-final, which means fear of the future changes. The future no longer feels like a verdict. It feels like uncertainty. And uncertainty, while uncomfortable, is less oppressive than judgment, because judgment implies evaluation. And the universe does not evaluate. It does not score lives. It does not rank outcomes. It does not measure success. Time passes regardless, which means time is not something we are being tested against. It is simply the condition under which experience unfolds. This realization softens one of the deepest existential tensions, the sense that life must justify itself before it ends. There is no such requirement. Nothing is waiting at the end of time to assess the journey. There is no summary screen, no report, no evaluation, just cessation of experience. And cessation, when stripped of narrative, is not punishment. It is conclusion. This does not make endings easy, but it makes them honest. Endings are not failures. They are completions. This is true of moments, relationships, lives. Everything that exists in time ends, not because it was insufficient, but because continuation is not guaranteed. And once this is accepted, the fear of time can begin to loosen its grip, not disappear. Loosen. Because fear often comes from imagining time as an adversary, something that steals, something that runs out, something that leaves us behind. But time is not acting against us. It is not acting at all. It is simply happening, and happening does not require consent. This reframing does not remove urgency entirely, We still feel pain. We still care. We still act. But urgency becomes situational rather than existential. We respond to what matters now, not because time is running out, but because this moment is what is available. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Because existential urgency is endless. It never resolves. Situational urgency passes when conditions change. And in an unattended universe, reducing unnecessary urgency is a form of self-preservation, which brings us to a deeper, quieter insight. When time loses its narrative pull, awareness becomes more tolerant of stillness. Silence no longer feels empty. Pauses no longer feel wasted. Nothing needs to happen immediately. And this tolerance is rare, because most of conscious life is spent resisting stillness, filling it, escaping it, distracting from it. But when there is no identity pushing forward and no future demanding arrival, stillness reveals itself as neutral, not blissful, not threatening, just present. This is where the universe and awareness briefly align, not in purpose, in indifference. The universe does not rush. Awareness, when unburdened, does not either. And in that shared neutrality, something settles, not peace, but equilibrium, a temporary balance between experience and expectation. This balance does not last. Identity returns when needed. Time reasserts itself when action is required. But once this balance has been tasted, consciousness knows something important, that it is not trapped in time. It operates within it. And operating within time is different from being dragged by it. This knowledge does not eliminate fear of death, but it reframes it. Death is not falling off the edge of a timeline. It is the end of access. No more moments available. No more experience. Not punishment. Not reward. Just closure. And closure, while sad, is not hostile. It is consistent. Which brings us to the next layer, waiting to unfold. If time is not a narrative, if identity is not fixed, if awareness does not belong to a self, then what does it mean that the universe itself has a beginning and may have an end? Does the universe experience time, or is time just something happening inside it? And if the universe is a system running unattended, what does it mean for a system like that to end? That question waits ahead, not as catastrophe, but as quiet speculation. Because when awareness loosens its grip on time, even endings begin to look different. And the drift continues, steady, unhurried, into the deeper structure of a universe still running, while awareness learns to stop chasing it. When time loosens its grip on awareness, a final assumption begins to weaken, the assumption that the universe itself is moving toward something. For as long as humans have looked outward, we have imagined the universe as a story, a beginning, a middle, an end, a sequence with direction, an arc that must be going somewhere even if we do not know where. This instinct mirrors our own experience. We are born, we change, we end, so we project that structure outward. But projection is not perception. In an unattended universe, direction is not guaranteed. Expansion happens. Entropy increases. Structures form and dissolve. But none of these imply intention. They imply condition. The universe does not want to expand. It does not seek heat death. It does not aim for equilibrium. These are descriptions, not motivations. And once awareness stops framing time as a narrative, it begins to notice something quietly unsettling. The universe may not be going anywhere at all. Not forward, not toward completion, not toward resolution. It may simply be unfolding according to constraints. And unfolding does not imply destination. Consider a fire spreading through dry grass. It moves. It changes shape. It consumes. But it is not traveling towards something. It is responding to conditions. The universe may be doing the same. Not a journey, a process. And processes do not need endings to be meaningful to the entities experiencing them. They only need continuity. This reframing alters how we interpret cosmic beginnings and endings. The beginning of the universe is often imagined as a dramatic event, a moment of creation, imbued with significance. But from within the system, It may simply be the earliest accessible state, not a start chosen, just the first state that could occur. Similarly, the end of the universe, whether through expansion, collapse, or quiet decay, may not be an ending in the narrative sense. It may be a state where no further configurations are accessible, not closure, not resolution, just exhaustion of possibility. And this matters deeply for consciousness, because so much of our existential anxiety comes from imagining ourselves as passengers on a journey with an inevitable destination. We fear being left behind. We fear missing the point. We fear reaching the end without understanding the purpose. But if the universe is not on a journey, then there is no destination to miss, no point to arrive at too late, no final meaning waiting beyond time. There is only process, and process does not judge its components. This realization is both relieving and destabilizing. Relieving, because it removes the pressure to align with a cosmic trajectory. Destabilizing, because it removes the comfort of believing that everything is moving towards something better or worse. There is no promise of improvement. There is no threat of ultimate failure. There is only change, which reframes the idea of progress. Progress is not something the universe pursues. It is something consciousness attempts, locally, temporarily, in pockets of experience where improvement can be felt. When suffering decreases, progress is perceived. When coherence increases, progress is perceived. When understanding deepens, progress is perceived. But these perceptions do not scale. They do not accumulate into cosmic advancement. They simply occur where conditions allow. This is why history feels both meaningful and futile. Meaningful to those who live through it, futile to the universe that does not remember it. And neither perspective is wrong. They operate at different levels. In an unattended system, there is no global objective function, no optimization target, no final state that validates the process, which means the universe does not succeed or fail. It just persists, and persistence is not an achievement. It is a condition. This reframes the question of cosmic endings yet again. If the universe eventually reaches a state where nothing complex can arise, where no stars form, no life emerges, no awareness appears, that is not a tragedy to the universe. It is simply another configuration. The tragedy exists only for those who anticipate it, for those who care, for those who imagine loss before it arrives, which reveals a quiet truth. Suffering about the end of the universe is a projection of consciousness. The universe will not mourn itself. It will not notice its own quieting. The concern exists only within awareness, and awareness, as we have seen, is not protected by the system. It is allowed, temporarily, which raises a question that feels almost taboo. If the universe does not care about its own end, why do we? The answer is not that we are more important. It is that we are finite. Finitude creates preference. A being that ends cares about endings. A process that persists does not. The universe does not end in the way we do. It changes state, and state changes do not feel like loss to a system without experience. This distinction helps dissolve one of the deepest existential fears, the fear that everything we care about will be erased. Erasure implies intention. Forgetting implies memory. The universe does neither. It does not erase. It does not forget. It simply does not retain. And non-retention is different from destruction. It means things cease to have effect, not that they are undone. What has happened cannot unhappen. It just stops mattering to anything capable of noticing. And noticing, again, is local, which means meaning does not disappear when the universe ends. Meaning disappears when there is no one left to experience it. And that disappearance is not violent. It is quiet. Like a room emptying, the room does not grieve the absence of voices. It simply becomes still. This reframing changes how we think about legacy. Legacy is not something the universe preserves. It is something consciousness imagines. We want our actions to echo beyond our lives, to matter after we are gone. But echoes require listeners, and the universe does not listen, which means legacy, like meaning, is local and temporary. It exists as long as there are minds to carry it. And this does not make legacy meaningless. It makes it relational. Your actions matter to those affected by them. Your words matter to those who hear them. Your existence matters where it is experienced. Beyond that, there is no registry, no cosmic archive, no eternal record. And this realization often feels like loss. Because we want permanence. We want assurance that what we do will outlast us. But permanence was never part of the system's design. The universe is not built to preserve. It is built to transform. And transformation does not accumulate. It replaces, which brings us to a subtle but important shift. When consciousness accepts that the universe is not going anywhere and not keeping score, the pressure to be remembered begins to fade, not disappear, fade. Because being remembered is a form of response. And we have already learned that the universe does not respond, which means the desire for cosmic recognition is misdirected. Recognition exists only among observers, and observers are rare, temporary, which makes recognition precious, not because it lasts, but because it happens at all. This changes how consciousness approaches its own actions. Instead of asking, "Will this matter in the end?" it begins asking, "Does this matter now?" Instead of seeking alignment with a cosmic story, it seeks coherence within experience. And this is not resignation, it is precision, focusing effort where effect is possible. This is where the metaphor of a forgotten universe becomes unexpectedly practical. If no one is monitoring outcomes, if no final report will be generated, if no future state will validate the present, then the only meaningful feedback loop is immediate experience. What reduces suffering now? What increases clarity now? What stabilizes awareness now? These questions are not small. They are the only ones that can be answered. Everything else is speculation. And speculation, while fascinating, does not change experience. This does not mean consciousness abandons curiosity about the universe. It means curiosity loses its existential burden. We can explore, not to find purpose, but to understand condition, not to justify existence, but to appreciate structure. The universe becomes interesting rather than meaningful, vast rather than purposeful, complex rather than significant. And in this shift, awe changes flavor. It is no longer reverent, it is observational, like watching weather patterns, like observing geological layers, like studying a machine that runs without reason. This does not diminish awe, it refines it. Awe without expectation, wonder without demand. This refined awe is quieter. It does not insist that the universe is speaking to us. It listens without expecting reply. And listening without expectation is lighter. This is where awareness begins to feel more at home, in indifference. Not because indifference is comforting, but because resistance has softened. The universe is not withholding meaning. It never offered it. And once that is accepted, the universe stops feeling like an antagonist. It becomes a condition, a context, a vast, impersonal field in which experience briefly arises. And this brings us to a final, delicate insight of this chapter. If the universe is not moving toward an end, and if time is not a narrative, and if identity is not fixed, then the idea of a life well lived cannot be defined by outcome. It cannot be defined by legacy. It cannot be defined by alignment with a plan. It can only be defined by quality of experience. Not pleasure alone, but coherence, clarity, the ability to respond rather than react, the capacity to care without expecting permanence. These qualities do not change the universe. They change how it is experienced, which may be the only change that ever mattered. And this realization does not conclude anything. It opens the next question. If the universe has no destination, if time is not leading anywhere, if awareness arises without purpose, then why does the universe allow complexity at all? Why not remain simple? Why not dissolve into uniformity immediately? Why do structures form, persist, interact in a system with no goal, That question points us toward the next layer, not of meaning, but of structure. Because perhaps the deepest secret of a forgotten universe is not that it lacks purpose, but that purpose was never required for complexity to arise. And that complexity, once present, changes everything for those who experience it. Even if the universe never notices, the system continues to run, unconcerned, unaware, while awareness, still present, prepares to look deeper into the machinery that made it possible at all. Complexity does not ask permission. It does not require a goal. It does not wait for intention. It does not need a reason to begin. It emerges when conditions allow it to emerge. This is one of the most difficult truths for consciousness to accept, because consciousness is built around purpose. It moves by intention. It orients itself by goals. It asks why, instinctively, reflexively, as if the question itself were a survival mechanism. But complexity arises without asking why at all. In an unattended universe, complexity is not planned. It is permitted. And permission, in this system, simply means nothing prevents it. When energy flows through matter under constraints, structure appears. When gradients exist, patterns form. When interactions repeat, feedback loops develop. None of this requires foresight. It requires time, which the universe has in abundance. This reframes the question of why the universe did not remain simple. Simplicity is not a stable endpoint. Uniformity is fragile. The slightest imbalance and asymmetry in density, a fluctuation in energy, creates gradients. Gradients create flow. Flow creates structure. The universe did not choose complexity. It fell into it. And once complexity appears, it tends to build on itself. Structures form that enable more structure. Patterns create conditions for further patterns. Stability at one level becomes scaffolding for instability at another. Stars form, enabling chemistry. Chemistry enables life. Life enables awareness. Not because any of these were destined, but because each step makes the next possible. This is the quiet engine of an unattended universe. Not intention, but permissive escalation. And escalation does not discriminate between outcomes. It produces beauty and catastrophe with equal indifference, which means the universe is not biased toward life. Life simply happens to be one of the configurations that complexity makes available. And awareness, our awareness, is even more precarious. It exists only at a narrow band of complexity. Too simple, and there is no reflection. Too complex, and coherence collapses. Consciousness exists on a knife's edge, not because it was designed to, but because it can. This precariousness explains why awareness feels miraculous, not sacred, improbable. And improbability creates wonder. But wonder, again, does not imply intention. A rare event is not meaningful to the system that permits it. It is meaningful only to those who experience it. Which brings us to a crucial shift. Once consciousness stops asking why complexity exists, it begins asking how complexity behaves. This shift changes everything. Instead of searching for cosmic purpose, awareness begins studying constraints. What allows structure to persist? What destabilizes it? What conditions amplify complexity? What causes collapse? These questions are not philosophical. They are structural, and the answers reveal a pattern that repeats across scales. Complex systems require balance between order and chaos. Too much order, and the system becomes rigid, incapable of adaptation. Too much chaos, and the system fragments, unable to sustain coherence. Life exists in between. Awareness exists in between, not because that region is special, but because it is the only region where complexity can persist long enough to notice itself. This is not destiny. It is selection without chooser. Configurations that collapse do not persist. Configurations that stabilize do. And persistence looks like success. But success, here, is not achievement. It is survival, which reframes intelligence entirely. Intelligence is not wisdom. It is not truth-seeking. It is not insight. Intelligence is pattern exploitation, the ability to detect regularities and use them to maintain coherence. Awareness does this at the experiential level. It notices what hurts and avoids it. It notices what stabilizes and seeks it. It notices what repeats and predicts it. None of this requires meaning. It requires memory. And memory is another emergent structure. Not guaranteed, not preserved, just permitted. This cascade from matter to life to awareness to memory did not happen because the universe wanted observers. It happened because nothing stopped observers from arising. And once observers arise, the universe becomes something new, not to itself, but to them. It becomes knowable, not fully, not accurately, but partially. And partial knowledge is enough to generate models, stories, maps of reality that guide behavior. These maps are not the territory, but they function until they don't. This is where complexity becomes dangerous, because complex systems generate internal representations of themselves, and representations can become misaligned. Models drift, beliefs harden, stories replace observation. When that happens, complexity collapses, not from external threat, but from internal rigidity. This is true of ecosystems, of economies, of cultures, of minds. An unattended universe does not correct these misalignments. It allows collapse. And collapse in this system is not punishment. It is reconfiguration. When a structure fails, its components are released back into the environment. They become available for new configurations. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is preserved. Everything is recycled without regard to identity. This is deeply unsettling to consciousness, because consciousness wants preservation. It wants continuity of the self, continuity of meaning, continuity of experience. But the universe does not preserve complexity indefinitely. It allows it temporarily. And temporary allowance is the most generous thing an indifferent system can offer. This realization reframes fear yet again. Fear is not evidence that something should not end. It is evidence that something wants to continue. And wanting is local. The universe does not want, awareness does. Which means fear is not a cosmic signal. It is an internal one. A message that a configuration is threatened. And threats are real at the local level. Lives end. Minds break. Structures collapse. These are not illusions. They are events. But they are not errors. They are transitions. This does not make loss gentle. It makes it intelligible. Loss is not the universe failing to protect complexity. It is the universe allowing complexity to change, which raises a subtle but important insight. If complexity exists only because it is allowed, then awareness exists only because it is allowed, not because it is necessary, not because it is chosen, which means awareness is not owed anything, not answers, not permanence, not comfort, and yet awareness exists, which means existence itself is not conditional on worth. You do not need to justify your presence. The universe did not ask you to be here. It simply did not prevent you. This realization carries an unexpected softness. If existence does not require justification, then neither does experience. You do not need to be useful. You do not need to be meaningful. You do not need to align with a cosmic plan. You are occurring, and occurrence in an unattended universe is enough. This does not remove responsibility. It relocates it. Responsibility is not to the universe. It is to complexity itself, to preserve coherence where it exists, to reduce unnecessary collapse, to avoid accelerating fragmentation, not because the universe demands it, but because complexity is rare, not sacred, rare, and rarity invites care, not cosmic care, local care. This is where ethics quietly re-enters not as law, but as stewardship. Stewardship of fragile configurations, of minds, of relationships, of cultures. Because once complexity collapses, it does not reassemble in the same form. The universe does not restore. It reconfigures, which means loss is irreversible at the level that matters to experience. Not because nothing replaces it, but because what replaces it is different. And difference is real. Which brings us to an insight that sits at the heart of this chapter. The universe allows complexity, but it does not protect it. Protection arises only within complexity itself, from systems that have learned through pain what collapse feels like. This is why compassion appears, not because the universe is compassionate, but because awareness recognizes fragility. We care because we know what it is like to break, and knowing that creates preference. Preference creates action. Action creates local order, which persists for a while, then changes, then dissolves. This cycle is not tragic, it is structural. And once consciousness understands this, something shifts again. It stops demanding guarantees. It stops expecting permanence. It begins to work with what is available. Here, now, under these conditions, this does not shrink ambition, it sharpens it. Instead of trying to matter forever, awareness tries to matter accurately, to reduce suffering where it appears, to increase coherence where possible, to maintain complexity long enough for experience to continue. These goals do not need cosmic endorsement. They are justified by effect, and effect is measurable, not in universal terms. In experiential ones, this reframing changes how consciousness views the future. The future is no longer a promised resolution. It is a field of possibility, constrained by present action. And possibility is not hope. It is openness, which means the future is not something to believe in. It is something to navigate. This is where the metaphor of a forgotten universe becomes fully grounded. If the universe is a system running without admin, then complexity is not a feature. It is a side effect. And side effects are not optimized. They are tolerated, which means awareness is tolerated, not celebrated, not condemned, just allowed. And allowance is fragile. It can end, not with warning, not with meaning, just with change. This does not diminish the value of awareness. It intensifies it, because value is highest where loss is possible, and awareness is always at risk, which makes every moment of clarity, connection, and care statistically improbable. Not in a poetic sense. In a structural one, this improbability does not require reverence. It invites attention, because attention is the only way complexity sustains itself. Without attention, systems drift. With attention, they stabilize. Briefly, and briefly is enough, which leads us to the threshold of the next realization. If complexity emerges without purpose, and awareness exists without guarantee, and time does not lead anywhere, then what holds everything together right now? What keeps the universe coherent in this moment, if nothing is directing it? The answer is not meaning, it is constraint. And constraint, once understood, reveals the deepest structure of this forgotten universe. That structure waits ahead, quiet, mathematical, indifferent, yet responsible for everything that exists, including the mind noticing it. And as awareness turns toward that structure, the drift continues, slow, steady, into the underlying logic that allows a universe to keep running, even after it has been forgotten. Constraint is not a force. It does not push. It does not pull. It does not decide. It simply limits what is allowed to happen. And in an unattended universe, constraint is everything. When awareness turns its attention toward what truly holds the system together, it does not find intention, purpose, or direction. It finds boundaries. Energy cannot exceed certain limits. Information cannot travel faster than a fixed speed. Matter cannot occupy the same state indefinitely. These constraints do not guide the universe toward meaning. They keep it from unraveling. In human thinking, we often imagine order as something imposed rules, enforced by authority, structure, maintained by oversight. But in the universe, order emerges not because someone enforces it, but because constraint restricts chaos. Constraint does not create patterns. It allows patterns to persist. This is a subtle but critical distinction. Without constraint, everything would happen at once. All configurations would collapse into noise. No structure could stabilize long enough to be experienced. Constraint slows change. Constraint narrows possibility. Constraint creates continuity. And continuity is what makes complexity possible. This is why, the universe still runs. Not because it is being watched, but because it is constrained. The equations that govern reality do not act as instructions. They act as boundaries. They say, this can happen, this cannot. Everything else is left open. In a sense, the universe is not executing a program. It is exploring a space of allowed states. And consciousness exists inside one of those states. Not privileged, not central, just permitted. This reframing removes the last trace of hidden intention. The universe does not hold together because it wants to exist. It holds together because nothing allows it to fall apart faster, which means stability is not a goal. It is a side effect of constraint. This realization is deeply counterintuitive. We are accustomed to thinking that things persist because they are supported. But in an unattended universe, things persist because they are not forbidden. Persistence is passive. Collapse requires permission too. And collapse, like everything else, only occurs when constraints allow it. This explains why the universe can feel simultaneously fragile and unbreakable. Fragile at the level of forms, stars, lives, civilizations, unbreakable at the level of structure. Forms dissolve constantly. Structure persists. And structure persists, not because it is cared for, but because nothing exceeds its limits. This is the deepest kind of indifference. The universe does not choose what survives. Constraint does. And constraint has no awareness. Which brings us to an unsettling implication. If constraint is what holds the universe together, then freedom is not the absence of constraint. Freedom is movement within constraint. Consciousness often imagines freedom as boundlessness. But boundlessness is unlivable. Without limits, nothing can be experienced. No contrast, no continuity, no stability. Constraint is what makes experience possible. And experience is all consciousness ever had, which means constraint is not the enemy of awareness. It is its precondition. This reframes how we think about suffering. Suffering does not arise because the universe is cruel. It arises because constraints do not prioritize comfort. They prioritize coherence. Energy flows where gradients exist. Pressure equalizes. Systems move toward equilibrium. These processes do not ask whether the transition hurts. They cannot. Pain is not a variable in the equations, which means suffering is not a signal that constraint has failed. It is a signal that experience exists in a system that does not optimize for it. And yet, without constraint, there would be no experience at all. No awareness to suffer. No one to notice. This is the paradox at the core of existence. The same boundaries that allow awareness to arise also guarantee that awareness will be limited, vulnerable, and temporary. There is no configuration where awareness is both infinite and safe. Not in this universe, which means fragility is not a flaw. It is structural, and structural truths do not change. They can only be worked with. This is where consciousness reaches a kind of sober clarity, not peace, not acceptance. Clarity. The universe is not held together by care. It is held together by limits. And limits do not negotiate, which means waiting for the universe to become kinder is a misunderstanding. The universe cannot become kinder. It can only continue. And continuation does not imply compassion. So if compassion exists, it must emerge locally, inside constrained systems that can feel the cost of constraint. This is where ethics finally finds its true footing, not as obedience to cosmic law, but as a response to structural reality. We care because we are constrained. We suffer because we are constrained. We recognize suffering in others because they are constrained in similar ways. Ethics emerges not from meaning, but from shared limitation. You hurt because you cannot exceed certain thresholds. So do others. That commonality is the basis of care. Not belief, not doctrine. Constraint makes empathy possible, because without shared limits, there would be no shared experience. Which means constraint is not only what holds the universe together, it is what makes connection possible. This connection is not endorsed by the universe. It is not protected. It is fragile, but it is real. And reality, in an unattended system, does not require endorsement to exist. This insight changes how awareness relates to control. Earlier, consciousness tried to control outcomes, to impose meaning, to steer experience toward comfort. But constraint reveals a different approach. Control is limited, influence is local, and acceptance is not surrender, it is calibration. Once you know the boundaries, you stop pushing against what cannot move. You begin working with what can. This is not passivity, it is precision. Energy is no longer wasted on resisting the structure of reality. It is directed toward modifying experience within that structure. This is where a quiet form of freedom appears, not the freedom to be anything, but the freedom to choose how to move within limits, to respond rather than react, to shape experience where shaping is possible. This freedom is modest, but it is real, and it is the only kind available in a universe without admin, which brings us to another unsettling clarity. The universe does not need to be supervised because its constraints already enforce coherence. There is no need for oversight, no need for correction. The system does not drift into impossibility. It explores possibility until it exhausts what is allowed. And when something is no longer allowed, when energy dissipates, when gradients flatten, when complexity can no longer be sustained, it ends. Not because someone decided it should, but because constraint no longer permits it. This includes consciousness. Awareness ends when the conditions that allow it are no longer present, not as punishment, not as failure, as consequence. This does not diminish awareness, it situates it. Awareness is not above the system, it is inside it, bound by the same constraints, which means awareness does not escape the universe. It participates in it, briefly, and that participation is not observed from outside. It is not logged. It is not remembered by the system, but it is experienced. And experience is not nothing. It is the only thing that ever mattered to those inside it. This realization brings a new kind of humility. Not humility before a higher power, humility before structure. The recognition that we are shaped more by what is impossible than by what is desired. And that recognition is strangely calming, because impossibility removes illusion. It tells us where effort is wasted, where struggle is futile, where acceptance is not resignation but alignment with reality. This alignment does not feel uplifting, it feels quiet, like standing still after realizing the room was never moving. The universe continues to run, not because it is guided, but because constraint keeps it coherent. And awareness, once it sees this, stops asking when the admin will return. There is no admin. There are only limits. And within limits, there is motion. Within motion, there is experience. Within experience, there is care. Not mandated, not guaranteed, but possible. Which brings us to the edge of the next question. If constraint is what holds everything together, and if constraint is indifferent, and if awareness exists within it temporarily, then what happens when constraint loosens? When the boundaries that allow structure begin to dissolve? When the universe drifts toward states where complexity is no longer permitted? What does a forgotten universe look like? Not when it is running normally, but when it begins to go quiet? That question does not announce itself with fear. It arrives softly, like a system slowing down, like background noise fading. And as awareness turns toward that possibility, the drift continues into the long, silent future of a universe that will not end dramatically, but will simply run out of ways to continue being complex. When constraints loosen, nothing announces it. There is no alarm, no rupture, no visible moment where the universe declares that something fundamental has changed. Constraint does not fail suddenly. It thins. The boundaries that once allowed structure to persist begin to relax, not because they are broken, but because the conditions that made them relevant slowly disappear. Energy spreads, gradients flatten, differences blur, and with that blurring, the universe does not collapse. It quiets. This is one of the most misunderstood ideas in cosmology and in consciousness alike. We imagine endings as events, explosions, implosions, catastrophes. But the deepest endings are not events. They are absences. The absence of contrast, the absence of tension, the absence of conditions that once made complexity possible. In an unattended universe, the end is not dramatic, it is subtle, because nothing resists it. Constraint does not oppose relaxation, it allows it. And once relaxation begins, everything that depended on tight boundaries begins to thin as well. Stars burn because gradients exist. Life persists because energy flows through narrow channels. Awareness arises because systems are balanced between order and chaos. When those balances drift even slightly, the system does not announce loss. It simply stops producing certain configurations. No more stars in some regions. No more chemistry complex enough to fold inward. No more feedback loops stable enough to hold experience. Not destroyed, just no longer allowed. This is what a forgotten universe looks like when it grows old. Not broken, exhausted. The future of the universe is often imagined as emptiness. Cold, dark, silent. But emptiness is not quite accurate. There will still be matter, still energy, still space and time. What will be missing is difference. And difference is what made everything else possible. Without difference, nothing flows. Without flow, nothing organizes. Without organization, nothing observes. Awareness does not end because it is punished. It ends because the universe no longer permits the narrow conditions that allowed it to arise. And this realization reframes the fear of cosmic endings. The end of complexity is not an attack on meaning. It is the natural consequence of constraint loosening, which means the universe is not hostile to awareness. It is simply indifferent to maintaining the conditions awareness requires. And indifference, again, is not cruelty. It is absence of preference. This perspective changes how we imagine the far future, not as annihilation, but as thinning. Processes take longer. Interactions become rarer. Events stretch across unimaginable spans of time, until eventually, nothing interacts strongly enough to matter to anything else. The universe does not stop. It just stops doing anything interesting. And interesting here does not mean meaningful. It means structured. This is where the metaphor of a server without admin reaches its quiet conclusion. The server does not crash. It does not shut down. It simply runs fewer and fewer processes until nothing complex is left running. No errors logged. No warnings issued. Just silence. And silence, when no one is listening, is not eerie. It is neutral. This neutrality is difficult for consciousness to imagine, because consciousness is built around contrast, sound and silence, presence and absence, self and other. Without contrast, experience cannot arise, which means the universe's quiet future is not something awareness will ever experience. Not because it is forbidden, but because awareness cannot exist there. This creates a strange inversion. We fear the future of the universe, but the future of the universe does not include us. Not as witnesses, not as sufferers, not as observers, which means the fear exists only now, inside awareness, and awareness, as we've seen, is temporary. This realization softens the fear in an unexpected way. The end of awareness is not an event awareness will experience. There is no final moment of knowing that awareness has ended. There is no darkness felt, no silence heard. Experience simply ceases to arise. And where experience does not arise, fear cannot exist. This is not comfort, but it is clarity. The fear of non-experience is always imagined from within experience. And imagination, again, is a local phenomenon. The universe does not anticipate its own quieting. It does not mourn the loss of complexity. It does not register the thinning of structure. These concerns belong only to minds that exist while structure still allows them. Which brings us to a subtle but profound shift. The future of the universe does not diminish the present. The fact that complexity will eventually fade does not make current complexity less real. A wave does not become meaningless because it eventually flattens. A flame does not become pointless because it burns out. Duration is not the measure of validity. Occurrence is, and occurrence is always now. This is where consciousness begins to let go of its last cosmic grievance. The grievance that the universe is unfair because it does not preserve what matters. But preservation was never promised, and promises require a promiser. The universe made none. Once this is accepted, something unexpected happens. Attention returns fully to the present, not as a coping strategy, not as a philosophy, but as a natural consequence. When the future no longer carries existential weight, and the past no longer defines identity, the present becomes the only place where anything actually happens. And happening, without narrative burden, feels different, simpler, not easier, but clearer, which reframes the idea of a forgotten universe. One last time, the universe was never meant to remember. Memory is not a feature of reality. It is a feature of complexity. And complexity, by its nature, is temporary, which means forgetting is not a failure of the universe. It is its default state. Everything that has ever mattered has mattered only while there was someone to whom it mattered, and that has always been enough. This understanding does not lead to despair. It leads to proportion. Our lives are not small because the universe is large. They are specific, localized, finite. And finitude does not negate significance. It defines it. A moment matters because it ends. A connection matters because it can be lost. Awareness matters because it is fragile. In a universe that will eventually go quiet, fragility is not weakness. It is the only place where experience can occur at all. This reframing allows consciousness to release one final demand. The demand that the universe justify experience. It does not need to. Experience just happens. And while it happens, it can be gentle or harsh, coherent or chaotic. Those qualities are shaped locally, not cosmically, which brings us to the threshold of the final realization. If the universe will eventually become quiet, and if awareness exists only briefly, and if nothing is being preserved, then the question is no longer why does anything exist? It is something much quieter. What does it feel like, right now, to exist inside something that will forget you? And that feeling is not dramatic, it is intimate. Because being forgotten by the universe does not mean being alone. It means being unobserved from above. But there are still observers here, still moments of contact, still experiences unfolding, still awareness present. And presence does not need to be permanent to be real. This realization does not end the drift, it slows it. Like a system approaching equilibrium, the universe continues to thin, constraints continue to relax, complexity continues to fade far in the future. But right now, constraints still hold, energy still flows, awareness still arises. And within this narrow window, this brief allowance, something continues to experience, quietly, temporarily, fully. And that is not a mistake. It is what happens when a universe is allowed to run long enough for something inside it to notice, even if nothing will remember that it ever did. The next chapter does not move forward in time. It moves inward toward the final question awareness can ask, not about the universe, but about what it means to rest briefly inside a moment that does not need to last. When everything else has been stripped away, the search for purpose, the need for permanence, the hope of cosmic response, what remains is not emptiness, it is rest. Not rest as sleep, not rest as escape. Rest as the absence of resistance. For most of conscious existence, awareness has been pushing against something, against uncertainty, against impermanence, against silence, against the idea that nothing is coming to explain or resolve what is happening. This resistance is subtle, constant, and exhausting. It shows up as tension in thought, as urgency in time, as a quiet pressure to make something of this before it ends. But when awareness finally understands the structure it inhabits, a universe without oversight, without memory, without intention, that pressure begins to release. Not because the universe has changed, but because awareness has stopped misinterpreting it. The universe is not withholding meaning. It is not delaying answers. It is not testing patience. It is simply not participating in the dialogue consciousness imagined. And once that is accepted fully, not intellectually, but experientially, the internal struggle softens. This softening is rest. It does not come from believing everything will be okay. It does not come from optimism. It does not come from hope. It comes from alignment with how things actually are. In a forgotten universe, rest is not given. It is discovered in the moment awareness stops arguing with reality. This is not surrender. Surrender implies defeat. This is consent. Consent to conditions that were never negotiable. Time will pass. Forms will change. Experience will end. These were never threats. They were facts. And facts do not need to be fought. They need to be understood. Once understood, something unexpected happens. Awareness no longer feels chased by time. Moments no longer feel like they are slipping away. They simply occur, fully, then they finish. And finishing is no longer interpreted as loss. It is interpreted as completion. This changes the texture of experience. Joy becomes lighter, not because it is shallow, but because it does not cling. Pain becomes cleaner not because it is mild, but because it does not compound into narrative. Neutral moments become visible, not dismissed as empty, but recognized as stable. Stability in an unattended universe is rare, and rarity invites attention. This is where rest becomes active rather than passive. Rest is no longer the absence of activity. It is the absence of unnecessary activity, the unnecessary activity of interpretation, of justification, of comparison, of projection. Awareness stops asking whether this moment should be happening. It recognizes that it is happening, and that recognition is enough. This is why rest feels so unfamiliar to most conscious beings, because most of life has been spent in preparation for something else. The next phase, the next explanation, the next state. But in a universe without destination, preparation never completes. There is no arrival, which means the only place rest can exist is here, not later, not after understanding, not after resolution. Here, this does not mean nothing matters. It means things matter while they are happening, not before, not after. This distinction is subtle but profound. A conversation matters while it is being had. A connection matters while it is felt. A thought matters while it is experienced. They do not need to echo. They do not need to accumulate. They do not need to justify themselves. This is not a reduction of value. It is a relocation of value from duration to presence. And presence does not require effort. It only requires attention. This is why rest feels like coming home not to a place, but to a condition. The condition of no longer demanding more from the moment than it can give. The moment can give experience. That is all. And that is enough. In a forgotten universe, rest is not a reward. It is the natural state that appears when struggle ends. Struggle against what? Against impermanence. Against silence. Against the lack of cosmic reassurance. Once those struggles dissolve, rest emerges on its own. Not imposed, not cultivated, just uncovered. This rest is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not feel triumphant. It feels ordinary. So ordinary that it is often overlooked, but its effects are profound. When awareness rests, it becomes more responsive, not reactive. When awareness rests, it becomes more precise, less scattered. When awareness rests, it becomes more compassionate. Not because compassion is commanded, but because resistance has dropped. Suffering is easier to notice when it is not filtered through self-defense. Care becomes simpler when it is not tied to identity. Action becomes cleaner when it is not driven by anxiety about outcomes. This is where ethics becomes effortless. Not because choices are obvious, but because motives are no longer distorted by existential fear. You help because helping reduces suffering. Not because it aligns with a purpose, not because it will be remembered, just because it changes experience. Here, now, this is the most grounded form of meaning available. Meaning without metaphysics, meaning without permanence, meaning without obligation, just impact. And impact is measurable. You feel it, others feel it. That is the entire loop. This understanding does not make life small. It makes it exact. Which is why, paradoxically, rest often arrives late in life or late in understanding, because it requires letting go of the idea that existence must justify itself. Existence does not need permission. It is already happening. And while it is happening, it can be gentle or harsh. That gentleness is shaped locally, by choices, by attention, by care. None of these are guaranteed, but all of them are possible. This is the final, quiet truth of a universe that has been forgotten. It does not give rest. It does not deny rest. It simply does not interfere. Rest is something awareness discovers when it stops expecting the universe to participate. And once discovered, rest changes how everything else is held. Work becomes something done, not something owed. Love becomes something shared, not something secured. Identity becomes something used, not something defended. Even fear changes. Fear no longer feels like a warning about the future. It feels like a sensation in the present. And sensations pass, which means fear, like everything else, is temporary, not meaningless. Temporary. This is the final form of clarity consciousness can reach without dissolving itself completely. Not certainty, not peace, but ease. Ease with uncertainty. Ease with impermanence. Ease with not being answered. This ease does not end inquiry. It changes its tone. Questions become softer, less desperate, more curious. Instead of asking, "What is this all for?" awareness asks, "What is happening now?" And that question always has an answer. Even if the answer is simple, even if the answer is quiet, even if the answer is just this breath, this sensation, this awareness, still present, still allowed, still occurring. Which brings us to the final movement. Not forward, not outward, but inward, toward the simplest possible recognition that nothing needs to be added to this moment for it to exist, that nothing needs to be removed for it to be complete. That awareness does not need permission to rest. The universe will forget. That was never in question. The only question left is whether awareness can stop fighting that fact long enough to feel what is already here. And that question does not demand an answer. It invites a pause long enough for experience to notice itself, without urgency, without expectation, without needing to last. The next chapter does not conclude. It exhales. Because the deepest realization in a forgotten universe is not about understanding more. It is about needing less. And in that needing less, awareness finally becomes still enough to listen not for answers, but for the silence it no longer has to resist. Nothing announces that this is the last movement. There is no signal that says this is the end. No marker separating what came before from what comes after. Because in a universe that does not conclude itself, endings do not arrive as events. They arrive as quiet states. This chapter does not finish the thought. It allows it to thin. Up to now, awareness has been moving through ideas of purpose, identity, time, complexity, constraint, and silence. Each layer peeled back not to reveal a hidden truth beneath, but to show that nothing was ever concealed. There was never a secret, only assumptions. And assumptions, once released, leave behind something unexpectedly gentle. What remains now is not insight. It is presence without demand. Awareness still exists. Experience still arises. Sensations still come and go. But the pressure to do something with them has softened. The pressure to interpret, to assign significance, to frame the moment inside a larger story. That pressure was never imposed by the universe. It was generated internally. And now, with nothing left to push against, awareness begins to settle not into meaning, but into neutrality, not indifference. Neutrality. Indifference rejects. Neutrality allows. The universe has always been neutral. It allowed stars to form. It allowed stars to die. It allowed awareness to arise. It will allow awareness to end. Not because it chose these things, but because nothing prevented them. This neutrality was never hidden. It was simply misread. Consciousness mistook neutrality for abandonment, silence for judgment, absence of response for refusal. But neutrality does not refuse. It does not accept either. It leaves things as they are, and leaving things as they are is not hostile. It is foundational. This is where the metaphor of a forgotten universe finally dissolves, because forgetting implies memory, and memory implies intention. The universe did not forget. It never remembered. It never noticed. And that absence of noticing is not something to overcome. It is something to rest within. Awareness, once it stops trying to be noticed, experiences a subtle shift. It stops performing, stops waiting, stops preparing for an audience that never existed. And without an audience, experience becomes strangely intimate, private, not hidden, but unshared beyond itself, which is exactly how it has always been. Every thought you have ever had, every sensation you have ever felt, every fear, hope, or clarity, all of it occurred without the universe registering a single one. And yet, they were real. They shaped you. They shaped others. They shaped moments. Reality does not require witnesses beyond those who experience it. This realization is not sad. It is stabilizing, because it removes a final layer of effort, the effort to matter in the right way. There is no right way. There is only experience happening under constraints. And experience does not need validation. It needs nothing. It occurs, and then it finishes. This does not strip life of depth. It strips it of excess weight. Without cosmic expectation, moments stand on their own. A laugh does not need to echo through time to be complete. A connection does not need to last forever to be genuine. A life does not need to justify itself to have been lived. These ideas are not comforting. They are clarifying. Comfort implies reassurance. Clarity simply shows what is already there. And what is there now is quiet, not emptiness. Quiet. The kind of quiet that exists when nothing is demanding explanation. In this quiet, awareness no longer searches outward. There is nothing left to find, not because everything has been answered, but because the need for answers has loosened. Questions may still arise. Curiosity does not disappear, but the questions change tone. They become exploratory rather than desperate, gentle rather than urgent. And urgency was always the source of exhaustion. Urgency to understand before time runs out. Urgency to matter before silence arrives. Urgency to extract meaning from a universe that never offered it. When that urgency fades, something simple becomes possible. Attention can rest on what is happening right now, not to analyze it, not to preserve it, just to notice. This noticing is not a technique. It is a natural consequence of no longer needing the moment to be something else. The universe does not demand productivity from awareness. It never did. Only awareness demanded it from itself. And now, with that demand gone, the system quiets. Breath continues. Sensations continue. Thoughts arise and dissolve. Nothing special, nothing missing. This is where many people expect a conclusion, a final statement, a resolution that ties everything together. But tying things together implies closure. And closure implies an ending with meaning. The universe does not end that way. Neither does awareness. Awareness does not conclude. It fades, or it continues, or it shifts, without announcement, without commentary. So this chapter does not conclude the inquiry. It lets it open, like a door that does not need to be closed, because there is no one on the other side waiting. The universe does not lean in when awareness quiets. It does not respond. It remains exactly as it is. And awareness, now aligned with that fact, stops leaning outward as well. It rests where it already is, not because rest is the goal, but because there is nothing left to resist. This is not transcendence. Transcendence implies leaving something behind. Nothing has been left behind. This is intimacy with condition, with limitation, with impermanence, with the fact that existence does not need to explain itself to be experienced. This understanding does not remove sadness. Loss will still occur. Pain will still arise. Endings will still come. But these experiences are no longer framed as violations. They are understood as transitions within constraint. And transitions do not require justification. They happen. This is the quiet dignity of a forgotten universe. It does not console. It does not accuse. It does not promise. It simply allows. And allowance, once recognized, feels strangely spacious, like standing in a vast room without needing to speak. No etcher required, no response expected, just presence. Which brings us to the simplest recognition of all. Awareness does not need the universe to care in order to care. Care does not come from above. It emerges where experience is fragile. And fragility is the price of complexity, not a flaw, a condition. So care continues, not because it will be rewarded, not because it will last, but because it reduces suffering while it exists. And that reduction is felt, which is enough. This is not meaning as a concept. It is meaning as function. Meaning that does not survive you, but supports you. Meaning that does not echo forever, but stabilizes now. And now is the only place where anything ever happened. The universe will go quiet one day. Not suddenly, not violently, gradually. Long after awareness like this has ended, that future does not invalidate this moment. It does not reach backward. It does not erase. Because erasure implies intention. And intention was never part of the system. What exists now exists fully, without needing to last, without needing to be remembered, without needing to be explained. And that may be the final clarity awareness can touch without dissolving into abstraction. That existence is not a message. It is an event, happening once, here, now, without witness beyond itself, without archive, without return, and that does not make it empty. It makes it complete. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be concluded. Nothing needs to be saved. The universe will forget. That was never in doubt. What matters is that, for this brief interval, something noticed. And noticing, even without reason, even without future, even without reply, was allowed. So the system continues. The universe runs, indifferent, vast, unaware. And awareness, having traced itself to this quiet point, does not vanish. It simply stops asking. And in stopping, it rests.